The town of Ash Hollow sat in a shallow valley between two ridges of dead yellow grass, and in the summer it baked like a brick in a kiln. The main street was unpaved, rutted from wagon wheels, and perpetually coated in a fine layer of red-brown dust that settled on every surface. The storefronts, the window ledges, the shoulders of the people who walked through it every single day and never seemed to notice anymore. It was not a pretty town. It had never been a pretty town. But it was the only town Lenora Pike had ever known. And so it was home in the way that painful things sometimes become home. Not because you love them, but because you don't know what else to call them. She had been born here. She had grown up here, 2 streets back from the main road, in a small clapboard house with a yard that her mother had filled with vegetable beds, and a stubborn rosebush that bloomed every May, no matter how bad the winter had been. She had gone to the schoolhouse on Birch Lane until she was 14, sat in the back row because the benches up front were claimed by the children whose fathers owned the feed store and the general supply and the blacksmith operation. She had learned reading and arithmetic and a little geography, and she had been, quietly and without anyone much noticing, one of the sharpest students in the room. But that was 7 years ago. A lot had changed. Her father had died first, a fever that came on fast and went nowhere for 3 weeks, and then took him on a cold Tuesday morning in February. Her mother had followed 18 months later, not from illness exactly, but from the kind of grief that settles into a body like water into sand. So gradual you don't notice it's filling you until suddenly there's no room left for anything else. She had simply stopped eating, then stopped sleeping, and then one morning she simply didn't wake up. That had left Cal and Lenora. Cal was 28 now, 6 years older than her, and he had their father's jaw and their mother's temper, and a way of carrying worry on his shoulders that made him look like a man 10 years older. He had taken over what remained of the family: the house, the small vegetable plot, the half-broken plow, the 2 goats, the mounting pile of debt that their father had left behind like an inheritance no one wanted. Cal worked hard. That was the truth of him. Whatever else could be said. He was up before dawn and asleep the moment he sat down in the evening, and he had taken on whatever work came available, hauling for the feed merchant, helping at the sawmill when a man called in sick, mending roofs in summer. He did not complain about it, or at least not to Lenora. He kept his suffering in his jaw, in the tight line of his mouth, in the way he counted out their coins at the kitchen table every Sunday evening, with the careful attention of a man who knew exactly how little stood between them and real trouble. Lenora kept the house. She cooked and cleaned and managed the vegetable beds and traded eggs at the market on Saturdays, and stretched their provisions with a kind of quiet creativity that nobody ever thought to compliment. She made do. That was the phrase her mother had used, and Lenora had taken it up like a hand-me-down coat, worn in places, but still warm. She did not mind the work. It was the town she minded. There was a woman named Vera Calhoun who ran the dry goods counter at the general supply, and she had a way of looking at Lenora that managed to be both assessing and dismissive at the same time. Like she was looking at a piece of fabric and finding it not quite the right weight. The flour again, Vera would say, not as a question, just a statement, a cataloging. Please, Lenora would say, the 20-pound sack if you have it. Vera would get it. But there was always a pause, a deliberate, performed pause, before she moved to the shelf, as though the request required consideration, as though Lenora's money was somehow less valid than anyone else's. And the thing was, it wasn't just Vera. Vera was just the one Lenora saw most often, the one whose particular brand of cruelty she had memorized the way you memorize a street you walk down every day. But the town was full of people like Vera, people who communicated their judgments in pauses and looks, and the particular angle of a turned shoulder. There was Morton Dale, who ran the livestock pen at the edge of town, and had once told his friend, loud enough for Lenora to hear, that some women just didn't know when to stop at the table. There was the cluster of girls her own age, Harriet Morse, Clara Webb, and the Saunders sisters, who had a way of going quiet when Lenora walked past, the silence itself a kind of commentary. There was the schoolteacher, Mr. Aldridge, who had long since stopped acknowledging her existence at all, as though she had aged out of being a person worth addressing. And then there were the men, or rather, the absence of them. Lenora was 21 when she first understood that she was not going to be courted. Not in Ash Hollow. She had understood it slowly, the way you understand that winter is coming. Not in one dramatic moment, but in a succession of small, accumulating signs. The absence of invitations. The parties she heard about after the fact. The Sunday morning church steps where young men chatted with girls Lenora knew were no brighter and no kinder than she was, but were smaller, softer featured, and therefore considered worth the trouble of conversation. She was not stupid. She understood what she looked like. She was tall, nearly 5'8", and broad through the shoulders and hips, built in the way her grandmother had been built, solid and capable, the kind of frame that was useful for the life they actually lived but was not, in the estimation of Ash Hollow, the kind of frame that made a man's eyes soften. She had heard herself described in fragments over the years: big girl, heavy set, that Pike woman, not much to look at, Cal's sister, poor thing. The poor thing was the one that stuck, because pity, she had found, was worse than contempt. Contempt at least acknowledged that you were worth the effort of a strong feeling. Pity required nothing, communicated nothing, changed nothing. It was just a word people said to feel better about not doing anything. The Saturday when everything began to shift was ordinary, in the way that days that change your life usually are, unremarkable in every surface detail, carrying nothing in its appearance to suggest that it would matter. It was July, hot and dry, the sky above Ash Hollow a flat and exhausted blue. Lenora had risen at 5:30, as she always did, and had spent the morning baking bread and shelling peas and hauling water from the well, because the goats needed extra water in the heat, and the vegetable beds were drying at the edges, and she had learned to anticipate problems before they became crises. By the time she set out for the Saturday market, it was 9 o'clock and already warm enough to make the walk unpleasant. She carried her basket, eggs, 3 dozen of them, wrapped carefully in cloth, and wore her better dress, which was green calico, faded but clean, and her mother's old boots, which were slightly too large and required an extra pair of wool socks to fit properly. The market was held in the square at the center of town, stalls arranged in a rough rectangle around the old stone well that no one used anymore. There were probably 30 people there, buying and selling and talking, the way they always were on Saturday mornings. Lenora had been coming to this market for 7 years. She knew where to go, what to say, how to make the exchange as efficient and painless as possible. She was almost through. 3 dozen eggs sold to Mrs. Fletcher, who kept house for the Aldridges and bought reliably every week without drama or excessive commentary. The basket lighter. The transaction done. She was heading back through the square when she passed the cluster of men outside the harness shop, and she heard it. The grunt. Just that. A single low sound timed perfectly to her passing, followed by a bark of laughter from the men around him. She knew who had made it. It was Dale. Morton Dale, the livestock man, red-faced and thick-necked and apparently incapable of passing a quiet moment. She did not look at him. She had learned not to look, because looking gave them the response they wanted, and not looking was the only small power she had. But she heard the laughter, and she heard, in the wake of the laughter, one of the men say, in a voice not quite quiet enough, "Cal's going to have a hard time finding anyone willing to take that on." She kept walking. She got to the edge of the square, turned down the alley beside the bakery, and stopped. She put her back against the wall. She pressed her hands flat against the rough wood, feeling the splinters through the fabric of her gloves. She breathed. In through the nose, slow and deliberate, the way she had taught herself to breathe when the alternative was something she didn't want to do in public. Cal's going to have a hard time. The thing was, and this was the part that made it so hard to simply shrug off and walk away from, the thing was that it was not entirely untrue. She had watched Cal count coins 3 Sundays ago and had seen, for the first time, how bad it really was. The debt was not decreasing. The work was not enough. They were managing, barely, at a level that could not sustain itself through another hard winter. And she had lain awake after that night and stared at the ceiling and tried to think of what she could do differently and come up with nothing. She was 23 years old, and she had no money of her own, no prospects, no training beyond the domestic, no connections outside of this small town that had never much wanted her. And in Ash Hollow, what that meant, practically, specifically, was that she was a burden her brother was too loyal to mention. She stood in the alley for 4 minutes. She knew because she counted them, a habit she had developed for getting through difficult moments, counting, slowly, giving herself a fixed endpoint. Then she picked up her basket, straightened her dress, and walked home. She did not tell Cal what she had heard. She told him the eggs had sold for the usual price, and that Mrs. Fletcher had asked after him, which was true, and then she served the noon meal and they ate mostly in silence, which was also the usual. Cal was quiet that day in a specific way she recognized, the way he got when he was working through something he hadn't decided how to share yet. He ate slowly, set down his fork several times without eating, pushed food around the plate. He was not a man who easily said difficult things. I heard from Pete Halloran, he said finally. Pete Halloran was a teamster who ran freight between Ash Hollow and the northern ranches. She looked up from her plate. I was telling me about a rancher out past the Vermilion Breaks. Man named Mercer, Rowan Mercer. Cal said the name carefully, like he was testing the weight of it. He's got a substantial operation out there. 800 acres, cattle, some horses. Pete says he's well regarded. That's good for Mr. Mercer, she said. Cal looked at his plate. He's looking for domestic help. Someone to manage the house, keep records, help with the provision accounting. Pete says he pays fair. There's a room included. The room hung in the air between them. Lenora set down her fork. Cal, just hear me out. I'm hearing you. It's good work, he said. Clean work. He's not... Pete says he's a respectable man. Not the kind to cause trouble. Just a working rancher who needs help running the household side of things because he doesn't have family to do it. And he wants someone to come live out there. It would be a position, a proper arrangement. He was still looking at his plate. Pete says the distance is about 40 miles. It's not so far. It was not so far. It was also not here. It was also, unmistakably, an arrangement, not a choice she was being offered so much as a solution to a problem she was half of. She thought about the men outside the harness shop. She thought about Vera Calhoun's deliberate pauses. She thought about the Sunday morning church steps and all those conversations she was never quite invited into. What does this arrangement involve exactly? She said. In terms of what he's expecting. Cal finally looked at her. His face was worn and honest and guilty. He's looking for a housekeeper, someone to manage the domestic operations of the ranch. That's what Pete described. Nothing. It's a legitimate working position. And if it goes well? He didn't answer immediately, and in his hesitation she heard the part he hadn't said yet. Cal, if it goes well, what happens? He exhaled. Pete said, and this is just what Pete said, not what I'm saying. Pete said that a man like Mercer, settled man, good property, it might be that he's looking for something more permanent down the line. Someone to be a partner in the operation, in the household. She was quiet for a moment. So you've agreed to send me to a man 40 miles away on the chance that he might decide he wants to marry me. That's not... He stopped, tried again. It's a position, a real job. What happens beyond that is nobody's business. Except it's my life. I know that. Do you? The words came out more sharply than she intended, and she saw him flinch, and she felt a quick twist of something. Not quite guilt, but adjacent to it. Because Cal was not a bad man. Cal loved her. She knew that. The problem was that love had not prevented him from making a calculation about her future that she had not been part of. I'm not sending you anywhere, he said quietly. You don't have to go. That's not... I would never make you do something you didn't want. But I thought you should know the option exists. He looked at the window. Things aren't getting better here, Lenora. They're not. I've thought about it every way I can think of, and I can't see how they get better. He paused. And I also know... I know what it's like for you in this town. I hear things. People say things when they think a man isn't paying attention or doesn't care. I care. I don't know how to fix it. She looked at her brother, at the worn lines around his eyes, at the way he held his shoulders, even sitting still, like he was bracing for something. I'll think about it, she said. She thought about it for 4 days. She thought about it while she was hauling water and shelling peas and mending the tear in Cal's work jacket and boiling the laundry on Monday. She thought about it in that particular way she had of turning something over and over, looking at it from every angle, trying to see what it actually was rather than what her feelings about it made it appear to be. What it was, stripped of everything else. An offer of work. 40 miles away. From a man she'd never met. In a place she'd never seen. With no guarantee of anything except that it would not be here. Not here. That was the part that kept surfacing. That was the part she couldn't argue herself past. She was not a person who ran from things. She had stayed in Ash Hollow through 2 parents' deaths and years of market-day cruelties, and the slow, accumulating understanding that this town had decided what she was and was not inclined to revise that decision. She had stayed because you stayed, because leaving required something, money, or a destination, or someone waiting for you, that she had not had. Now maybe she had something close to a destination. She thought about what she would be leaving. the rose bush, the vegetable beds, the sound of the well pulley in the morning, the back room of the house where she slept, where the wallpaper had a pattern of small blue flowers that she had memorized in every configuration. The particular quality of afternoon light through the kitchen window. Cal. She would be leaving Cal. That was the one that was hardest to hold. Not because she depended on him, she was clear-eyed enough about their dynamic to understand that the dependency ran both ways, and possibly more from his side than hers. But because for all the complexity of what he'd done in bringing this arrangement to her, he was still the only person in the world who had loved her continuously since she was born. You didn't leave that easily, even when you needed to. On the fourth night, she sat at the kitchen table after he'd gone to sleep, and she got out a piece of paper, and she wrote 2 columns. She wrote stay at the top of one and go at the top of the other. Under stay, she wrote Cal, house, garden, familiar. She looked at it for a while. Under go, she wrote work, wages. Somewhere that doesn't know me yet. She looked at that for a while, too. Then she folded the paper and put it in her pocket and went to bed. In the morning, she told Cal she would go. She had 11 days before the wagon came. Pete Halloran had arranged the transport, a supply wagon, making the northern run that would drop her at the cutoff for Iron Ridge Ranch, where apparently someone would meet her. She used those 11 days carefully. She put the garden in good order, leaving Cal with a clear and detailed accounting of what needed to be done and when. Not that she thought he would do it, but because writing it out made her feel like she was leaving something useful rather than just leaving. She repaired everything in the house that could be repaired with the materials they had. She cooked and preserved enough food to last him several weeks, and she showed him, patiently and without commentary on the fact that she had to show him, where everything was kept and how to use the stove properly when it was running hot. She packed 1 bag. She did not have much, so this was not as difficult as it might have been. 2 dresses, her work clothes, her mother's shawl, green wool, worn thin at the elbows but still warm, her Bible, which she kept for the comfort of familiar weight rather than for reading, a small collection of practical items, her sewing kit, a book of household accounts she'd kept for their own use and thought might be useful for the new position. On the morning of her departure, she rose before dawn and stood in the garden in the gray early light, looking at the rose bush. It was not yet blooming, too early in the season, but the canes were green and there were small swellings of bud at the joints. It would bloom. She just wouldn't see it. She heard the back door and Cal was there, dressed already, coffee in hand. He looked like he hadn't slept much. They stood together in the garden for a moment. "You're sure?" he said. "No," she said honestly, "but I'm going anyway." He nodded. He didn't say anything else for a minute. Then, "I shouldn't have gone around you, with the arrangement." He was looking at the rose bush. "I should have talked to you first before I'd talked to Pete, before anything was—" He stopped. "I handled it wrong." "Yes," she said. "You did." He looked at her then. She thought he might argue, might offer some justification about debts or circumstances or the limited options available to a man in his position. But he didn't. He just nodded again, a single small movement, and she understood that this was as close as Cal had ever come, or might ever come, to a real apology. "Right when you get there," he said. "I will." The wagon came at 6:30, Pete Halloran on the box with his usual economy of expression, and Lenora put her bag in the back and climbed up without excessive ceremony. She looked back once as they rolled out of Ash Hollow, looked at the house and the small square of garden, and the figure of her brother standing in the yard watching her go, and then she faced forward. The road north was unpaved and rutted, and the wagon swayed and creaked on every irregularity, and the sun came up slowly behind a band of thin cloud, and the town fell away behind her, and then the valley fell away behind her, and they were in open country, rolling grassland and low scrub, and the occasional stand of cottonwood along the dry creek beds. It was the farthest from home she had ever been. She held her bag in her lap and breathed and watched the landscape change and tried not to think too hard about what she was going toward. She had made the decision. It was too late to unmake it. The only useful thing now was to arrive. Pete Halloran was not a talkative man, which suited her. He drove, she sat, and the miles accumulated in relative quiet. Occasionally he would point out a landmark, the red rock formation they called the Devil's Chair, the abandoned homestead at the river bend, the place where the road forked and the northern fork became noticeably worse. But he did not press her for conversation and did not seem to expect any. Around mid-morning she asked him what he knew about Mercer. "Fair enough question," Pete said, not taking his eyes off the road. Mercer's been out at Iron Ridge 6, 7 years now. Come from somewhere east, Kansas, I think, or thereabouts. Built the operation from raw land. He's not the easiest man to know, but he's straight. Pays his debts, keeps his word. Is he... She searched for how to phrase it. Is he a difficult man to work for? Pete thought about it in the honest way of a man who didn't perform his answers. He's particular. He wants things done right. But he's not the kind who yells, he paused. He's had some trouble finding good help out there. It's remote. Most people don't like the isolation. What kind of trouble? The last housekeeper lasted 3 weeks. One before that, about the same. He shrugged. It's a working ranch. It's hard work, and there's not much by way of town life. I'm not much for town life, she said. Pete glanced at her sideways. Something in his expression shifted, not quite a smile, but something adjacent. No, he said. I don't suppose you are. They stopped at midday to rest the horses and eat, and Lenora produced the provisions she'd packed: bread, hard cheese, some early season apples, and Pete accepted his share with the brevity of a man who neither expected nor required ceremony. They ate beside the wagon in a companionable sort of quiet, while the horses cropped at the sparse grass at the roadside. How far now? She asked. Another 4 hours, give or take. She nodded. The landscape around her was drier than what she was used to, the grass shorter and sparser, the sky larger somehow, the kind of large that makes you aware of your own small size within it. She was not sure she minded it. It felt clean, empty in a way that was different from the emptiness she was used to. You're not nervous, Pete said. It was almost a question. I'm very nervous, she said. I just don't think it helps to show it. Pete nodded slowly, as though this was a satisfactory answer. He finished his apple and stood up and brushed the crumbs off his jacket. Come on then, he said. Let's get you there. Iron Ridge Ranch announced itself gradually. First the fence line, post and wire, stretching away in both directions across the flatland, newer than she'd expected, the post still pale. Then the gate, a simple structure of rough timber with the letters IRM burned into the crossbar. Then, a half-mile along the ranch road, the buildings themselves coming into view, low and solid and functional, built without ornament but without carelessness either. The main house was larger than she'd imagined. Not grand, nothing out here was grand, but substantial. 2 stories of weathered timber, a long porch across the front, a stone chimney at the west end. Behind it, connected by a covered walkway, the cookhouse. Beyond that, visible through a gap in the buildings, the barn, dark red, recently painted. Pens and outbuildings stretching back from there. There were people working. She could see them in the yard and at the barn. Hands. 3, 4 of them visible from this distance, moving with the unhurried efficiency of men who knew their jobs. A dog, large and tan, came trotting from the direction of the barn to investigate the wagon, barked once, and then lost interest. Pete pulled up in front of the house and set the brake. Here you are, he said. Lenora climbed down from the wagon. She straightened her dress, which had creased badly over the journey, and picked up her bag, and she stood in the yard of Iron Ridge Ranch and looked at the porch of the main house and felt, very clearly and specifically, that she had arrived at something the shape of which she could not yet determine. The front door opened. It was not what she'd expected. She wasn't sure, if pressed, she could have said what she had expected. Something more deliberate, maybe, something that announced itself. But the man who came out onto the porch was simply a man. Tall and lean and dark-haired, wearing work clothes, denim trousers, a canvas shirt with the sleeves rolled back, with the ease of someone who put no thought into appearance because appearance had stopped being relevant to his life some time ago. He had a kind of weathered quality about him, not old but seasoned, the way timber gets when it's been outside in all conditions for years. His face was angular, not handsome in any conventional sense, but specific, the kind of face that had been shaped by what had happened to it. He came down the porch steps and looked at her with a directness that was not rude, but was entirely unperformed. Miss Pike, he said. His voice was low and even. Mr. Mercer, she said. He looked at her for a moment, just a moment, and it was not the look she was used to, not the assessing look of Vera Calhoun, or the contemptuous appraisal of the men at the harness shop. It was simply the look of a man trying to form an accurate first impression. Then he shifted his eyes to Pete. Good trip? Decent enough, Pete said. Stay for supper? Can't. Need to make Bender's Crossing before dark. Pete had already climbed back to the box. He touched his hat toward Lenora. Good luck to you. And then the wagon was moving, turning in a wide arc in the yard, heading back down the ranch road, and Lenora was standing there with her one bag, and Rowan Mercer was looking at the departing wagon and then back at her. "You'll want to see the house," he said. It was not quite a question. "Yes," she said. He led her up the porch steps and through the front door, and she followed, and the door swung shut behind them, and that was that. The house was clean but sparse, in the way of a place maintained by someone who understood the necessity of order without much interest in comfort. The front room held a table, 4 chairs, a stone fireplace with a plain wooden mantel, and a bookcase with a respectable number of volumes, which surprised her. The cookhouse was well equipped, a good cast-iron stove, a large work table, adequate shelving, and someone had made an attempt at organization that had partially succeeded. He showed her through, without commentary, and she followed and looked and stored what she saw. "Your room is upstairs," he said. "End of the hall. It's not much, but it's private. The hands don't come in the house." The room was small and square with a window that looked east over the flats. A bed, a chest of drawers, a washstand. Plain curtains that someone had made at some point, now faded. Not much, but private. She put her bag on the chest of drawers and stood at the window and looked out at the landscape spreading away from the ranch in the direction of the morning sun, flat and immense and absolutely quiet. "I appreciate you coming out," he said from the doorway. She could hear the restraint in the phrasing, the effort to be civil without claiming more warmth than existed yet. "Thank you for the position," she said. A small silence. "Halloran probably told you about the others," he said. He mentioned it. "The work is hard. I won't pretend otherwise." He paused. "I'm not looking for someone to perform at anything. I need the house run properly, the provision records kept, the meals organized. I eat simply. I don't require—" He seemed to search for the word. "Fuss." She turned from the window. "I don't do fuss," she said. He looked at her for a moment. "No," he said. "I don't suppose you do." He straightened slightly. "Supper's at 6. I can manage it tonight. Give you a chance to get settled. Tomorrow you'll have the run of the cookhouse." "That's fine," she said. He nodded and left the doorway, and she heard his boots on the stairs, measured, unhurried, and then the sound of the front door. She turned back to the window. The light out there was the color of old honey, stretching across the flats in long horizontal lines, and the grass moved in a slow wave in the evening breeze, and somewhere out toward the pens a horse was making a sound. Not distress, just presence, just the particular note of an animal announcing itself to the evening. She stood there for a long time, not thinking exactly, more like receiving, the way you receive something you haven't had words for yet. Then she unpacked her bag, carefully, deliberately, each item placed where it belonged, and went downstairs to see what needed doing. Supper that first night was beans and cornbread and salted pork, eaten at the table in the front room with the evening coming in blue through the windows. 2 of them, across the table, and the silence between them was not comfortable yet, but was not hostile either. It was the silence of strangers who were being careful. She ate. He ate. He poured water. She thanked him. After a while he said, "How long were you in Ash Hollow?" "My whole life," she said. 23 years. He absorbed this. "Family there?" "My brother." He nodded. He didn't push further. "You're from Kansas," she said. He looked up, a slight shift in his expression. "Halloran," he said. He mentioned it. "East Kansas," he said. "A long time ago now." "Do you go back?" "No." He said it simply, without drama. Just a fact. "There's nothing to go back to." She understood that kind of statement. She didn't press it. After supper she washed the dishes while he went back outside. There was apparently always something to be seen to at the end of the day, some task that couldn't be set aside. And she stood at the cookhouse window and washed dishes in the last of the daylight, and listened to the sounds of the ranch settling into evening, the distant clatter of the hands at their own quarters, the occasional animal sound from the pens, a door somewhere, wind. It was strange. It was unfamiliar in every specific and particular detail. She did not feel unwelcome. That was not nothing. In 23 years in Ash Hollow, she had felt unwelcome in places she had been 100 times. She had felt unwelcome at the Saturday market, at the church steps, at every social occasion the town produced. She had learned to manage unwelcome the way you manage a chronic pain, working around it, accommodating it, trying not to let it define your movements more than necessary. Here, in this kitchen, in this stranger's house, on the first evening of whatever this was going to be, she did not feel unwelcome. She dried the dishes and put them away. She found the lamp and lit it. She sat at the cookhouse table for an hour and made a list of what she needed to know to run the provisions properly, what stores were on hand, what the schedule of the hands was, how many she was feeding, and when. Then she went upstairs and lay in the narrow bed with the east window showing her a sky full of unfamiliar stars. And she was asleep before she'd finished the thought she'd started. Outside, in the late evening, Rowan Mercer stood on the porch with his coffee going cold in his hand and looked at the light in the upstairs window and thought about nothing in particular, or tried to. He was not quite sure what he'd expected. He was not quite sure what he'd got. Something capable was his impression, something that had been through more difficulty than it showed. He drank his cold coffee and went inside, and the light in the upstairs window eventually went out. The ranch was quiet. The stars were very bright. It was the first night of something neither of them had a name for yet. The first week at Iron Ridge was not kind to her. That was the honest way to say it. Not cruel, not unbearable, but not kind either. It was the kind of week that strips away whatever picture you'd assembled in your head and replaces it with the actual, specific, unvarnished thing, and the two are rarely the same. She had understood, in the abstract, that a working cattle ranch in open country was a different proposition from a household in town. She had told herself she was prepared for hard work, and she had meant it sincerely because she was not a woman who shied from difficulty. But there is a category of hard that is different from what you have known, and you cannot truly understand it until you are standing in it. The cookhouse stove ran hot and unpredictable, catching in a way she hadn't encountered before, so that her first morning's breakfast, biscuits and eggs for Mercer and 4 ranch hands, came out uneven, some biscuits pale and soft, others dark at the bottom, and she had to make a second batch while the first sat in its shameful condition on the work table. She served what she had. No one commented, but she felt it. The provision system was a disaster, or rather, it was the absence of a system. The stores were in 4 different locations, some in the cookhouse cellar, some in the main house, some in a shed behind the barn that she hadn't been told about until she found it herself while looking for a missing sack of dried beans. Whoever had been managing provisions before had done so with the organizational logic of someone who expected to remember everything in their head and had apparently not anticipated leaving. She spent the better part of 2 days just establishing what they actually had. The water situation was another matter. The well was farther from the cookhouse than was practical, and there was no established routine for hauling. The hands filled a barrel near the barn for their own use, but had apparently considered the house water someone else's problem. She started hauling it herself each morning, which added a solid hour to the front end of her day. Rowan Mercer was not unhelpful, but he was also not present in the way that would have made certain questions easy to ask. He was up before she was, and out before she'd finished the morning meal, and he came in for the noon meal briefly and with the specific economy of a man who considers eating primarily a functional activity, and supper was the main time she saw him at any length. Even then, he was more likely to sit with a cup of coffee after eating and review the day's tallies than to make conversation. She did not resent this. She understood it, or thought she did. It was the rhythm of a man who had arranged his life around solitude and had forgotten, or perhaps never fully learned, how to accommodate another person's presence without retreating into his own logistics. She had met people like that. Her father had been something like that, before her mother's relentless good humor had worn grooves in him. What she did not understand in that first week was what he thought of her. I was not unkind. That was clear enough. He said please and thank you with the same even consistency he seemed to apply to everything, not as performance but as habit, the way a man who was raised right keeps doing the right thing even when he's not thinking about it. When she served a meal, he ate it without complaint. When she asked him a question about the ranch, he answered it completely. But he did not look at her the way she was used to being looked at. He did not look at her with pity or assessment or the particular evaluating quality she had grown up with. He looked at her the way he looked at most things, directly and briefly and without lingering. And she could not read anything particular in it. She told herself this was fine. She had not come here to be read. She had come here to work. So she worked. By the end of the first week, she had mapped the entire provision situation, established a logical organization for the stores. and repaired the stove's draft control with a piece of wire she found in the tool shed. The biscuits on Friday morning were better. Not good. She was still calibrating the stove, but better, consistently baked. She counted this as progress. The hands were a separate question. There were 4 of them. A compact, dark-skinned man named Dex, who was the oldest and seemed to function as the foreman when Mercer wasn't present. A pair of young brothers, Jesse and Colt Rafferty, who were perpetually in some state of minor disagreement with each other. And a quiet, angular man called Marsh, who she gathered had been at Iron Ridge the longest of any of them, and who communicated primarily in nods. They were not unfriendly. But they were also not sure what to make of her, which she recognized as a specific kind of wariness that people have around something new in their established environment. She had been the new thing in enough places to know the look of it. She did not push. She served their meals, answered direct questions directly, and let time do what time does. It was Dex who broke first, which she had guessed would be the case. He had the air of a man who found prolonged awkwardness more trouble than it was worth. "You ride?" he asked on Thursday, when she was coming back from the shed with a sack of cornmeal over her shoulder. "No," she said. "I haven't." He considered this with the serious attention he appeared to give most things. "Ought to learn," he said. "Gets you around faster. Mercer won't say it, but it'd be useful." "Is that an offer?" He shrugged with one shoulder. "I got 20 minutes on most mornings before the day gets going." "I'll think about it," she said. She thought about it for approximately 10 minutes and then decided yes, because she was not a woman who declined opportunities to learn useful things on grounds of dignity. She told Dex the next morning, and he nodded, and that was the beginning of that. The writing lesson took place each morning at 5:30, before the day properly started, in the smaller pen behind the barn. The horse Dex gave her to learn on was a gray mare named Dolly, who had the patient temperament of an animal that had given up expecting humans to know what they were doing and had decided to be helpful anyway. Lenora fell off Dolly twice in the first week of lessons. The second time she hit the ground hard enough to knock the breath out of her, and she lay there for a moment staring at the sky, and Dex looked down at her from the fence where he was watching. "You all right?" he said. "In a minute," she said. She got up. She got back on. Dex watched this without comment, but something shifted in his expression. A small, quiet recalibration. And after that he was somewhat less reserved in his manner with her, which she took to mean she'd passed some kind of test that she hadn't known she was being given. The Rafferty brothers remained a challenge. Not hostile exactly, but unsettled in the way of young men who hadn't quite decided whether to be charming or difficult and kept cycling between the two depending on the day. Jesse, the older one, was inclined toward charm when he thought it would work and fell back on sullenness when it didn't. Colt, the younger, was easier, genuinely good-natured under the performance of being prickly, and she had dealt with enough genuinely prickly people to recognize the counterfeit version. She managed them the way she managed most things, consistently and without drama. She fed them well. She did not play favorites. When Jesse made a remark one morning about the thickness of the gravy, not quite an insult, but in that territory, she looked at him with a steady, unremarkable calm until he looked away. She did not say anything. She had found, over years, that saying nothing was frequently more effective than saying something, because people who make remarks like that are generally looking for a reaction, and denying them the reaction was its own kind of answer. After that, Jesse ate his gravy without commentary. Marsh she did not try to crack. He was not a man who cracked. He was, she thought, simply someone who had gone quiet so deep and for so long that it had become structural, and that was fine. He came and ate and nodded and went. She made sure his portion was adequate and left him alone, and she had the sense that this was exactly what he wanted, and that he appreciated it in his way. The second week was better than the first. The stove was no longer a mystery. The provision system worked. The morning routine had established itself with the kind of organic logic that routines develop when you let them find their own shape. She rose at 5, hauled water, started the stove, had breakfast ready by 6. She was tired in a way she had not been before. A clean, deep tiredness that sat in the muscles rather than the mind, which was, she was discovering, a more bearable kind of tired than she'd been used to. In Ash Hollow, her tiredness had often carried a quality of futility, a sense that the effort expended had not amounted to anything that mattered. Here, the effort had immediate and visible consequences. She could see the result of her morning's work in the organized cookhouse, in the hot meal on the table, in the provision ledger that was now, for the first time, actually accurate. she began, cautiously and without announcing it, to feel something she identified after some thought as usefulness. It was a modest feeling, she did not inflate it. But it was there. It was on a Wednesday evening, toward the end of her second week, that she had the first conversation of any real length with Rowan Mercer. It started because of the ledger. She had brought it to the supper table. This was practical, not presumptuous. She needed him to verify the cattle tallies so she could reconcile the provision use against headcount. And he had looked at it without any visible reaction, which she'd been half expecting would be discomfort. Men who ran things on instinct and memory sometimes felt accused by ledgers, as though the act of writing things down implied that they couldn't be trusted to remember them. But Mercer looked at the ledger the way he looked at most things, directly and seriously. "You rearranged the columns," he said. "The original arrangement didn't make the quarterly calculation easy," she said. "I can put it back if you prefer." "No." He turned to the second page. "This is better." He was quiet for a moment, reading. "The seed grain column. You've separated the corn from the oat. They have different turnover rates. It made more sense to track them separately." He looked up at her. It was the same direct, brief look, but this time there was something in it that hadn't been there before. Not exactly appreciation, more like the quality of attention a person gives when they've revised their estimate of something. "Where did you learn accounting?" he said. "I didn't," she said. "I just kept our household accounts at home, and it seemed logical." "Logical," he repeated, not skeptically, just as though he was placing the word somewhere. She went back to her supper. He went back to the ledger. After a while he said, without looking, "We've been losing about 8% of the winter stores to spoilage. I've never been able to figure out where." She had noticed this. She had, in fact, spent part of the previous afternoon in the cellar working out where. "It's the root cellar," she said. "The north wall is getting damp through the stone. It's not catastrophic yet, but it'll get worse in the fall rains. The potatoes and the dried corn are most affected." He set down the ledger. He looked at her. "You found this in the cellar?" "I was doing the inventory." A pause. "Dex mentioned the cellar wall 2 years ago," he said. "I didn't get around to it." "I could manage the rotation in the meantime," she said. "Move the most vulnerable stores to the higher shelves. Keep the root vegetables away from the north side. It won't fix the wall, but it'll slow the spoilage." I was quiet for a moment. He had a way of being quiet that was not uncomfortable. It was simply the quiet of a man who thought before he spoke, which she found, after 23 years of people in Ash Hollow who did not, quietly refreshing. "All right," he said. "Yes, do that. Then, I'll have Dex look at the wall this week." They finished supper. He took his coffee to the front room, and she washed the dishes, and the evening settled around Iron Ridge in its usual way. But as she was drying the last pan, she realized that the conversation, the actual back and forth of it, the quality of it, had been the first one in longer than she could count where she had not felt herself performing. Not managing someone's reaction to her, not calculating what she could say versus what she couldn't, not carrying the awareness of her own presence as a thing to be apologized for. She had just talked about a root cellar and a ledger and practical things. And he had listened and responded, and nothing had been strange about any of it. She put the pan away and blew out the cookhouse lamp and went upstairs. Outside the east window, the flats were dark, and the stars were out in force, the Milky Way a clear smear across the middle of the sky. She stood at the window for a while, not thinking, not exactly, and then she got into bed and slept, and she did not dream. The third week brought rain, which on a cattle ranch in dry country was not the simple inconvenience it would have been in town. The rain turned the ranch road into something that fought you, and it turned the yard into a series of small lakes that had to be navigated carefully. And it made every physical task at least a third harder because everything was wet and the mud pulled at your boots with every step. She discovered on the third day of rain that the cookhouse roof leaked in 2 places. Not badly, but enough to require positioning buckets and rearranging the work table, which changed the entire spatial logic of the space she'd gotten used to. She managed it. But she also noted it in the provision ledger because a roof that leaked in light rain would leak worse in heavy rain, and it needed to be on someone's list. She showed Mercer the notation that evening. "I know about the roof," he said. "Then it should probably move up the list." He was looking at the notation with the expression she was coming to recognize as his thinking face. Not irritated, not dismissive, simply engaged with a problem. "The south side is worse," he said. "I've been putting it off because the timing hasn't been right." "When would the timing be right?" "When there's a dry week and enough hands free from the other work." he paused. Which is difficult to engineer simultaneously. Could I help with it? She said. He looked at her. On a roof? I've helped with roofs before, she said. In Ash Hollow. Cal and I patched ours twice. He was quiet for a moment. There was something in his expression she couldn't entirely read. Not doubt exactly, but something careful. It's not a small job, he said. I didn't say it was small. I said I could help. Another pause. The rain was coming down steadily outside, drumming on the roof in the places it was sound and dripping through in the places it wasn't. All right, he said, when the weather breaks. She nodded. He went back to the ledger. She went to refill his coffee, and she was aware, not with any particular weight, just as a simple fact, that this was the third or fourth time in 2 weeks that he had said all right to something she'd proposed, and that he had not, in any of those instances, prefaced it with doubt or modified it with conditions. He had simply assessed what she said against what he knew and decided it was reasonable. She could not have explained precisely why this mattered so much. It was not a large thing. It was just consistent. And consistency, she had found, was rarer than it should be. The rain broke on a Thursday, and by Saturday the ground was dry enough. Mercer came to find her that morning while she was in the middle of preserving the last of the early season apples. The weather's held, he said. She set down the jar she was sealing. I know, I saw. He had Marsh and Dex ready with the materials. New cedar shingles, fresh tar, the longer ladder from the barn. She came out in her work clothes, the heavy skirt she'd brought specifically for practical tasks, an old canvas apron, and nobody said anything about it. Marsh handed her a bundle of shingles without ceremony. Dex showed her where the worst sections were. She had not been wrong about her ability. She was not fast on the roof. Dex had the ease of a man who'd done this particular task before and moved accordingly. But she was steady and methodical, and she did not hesitate at the height, which she could see Mercer registering from where he stood below, handing up materials. At one point she was working a section near the peak, and a shingle slipped from her grip and skidded down the slope, and she caught it with her foot before it went over the edge. A reflex more than a decision, and she heard Mercer below issue a short, sharp exhale, not quite a word. And she looked down to see him watching with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. It was not alarm exactly. It was the expression of a man who had experienced something quick and alarming and was in the process of recalibrating. I've got it, she said. I see that, he said. His voice was level, but there was something underneath it. She went back to the shingle. She placed it and nailed it and moved on. When she came down at noon for the meal break, she was aware of his eyes following her across the yard, and she was not sure what to do with that, so she didn't do anything with it. She went in and made food and brought it out, and they ate in the yard in the thin winter sunlight, and nobody talked much. But that afternoon, when they were finishing the last section and the light was going orange and low, Rowan Mercer climbed up the ladder, which she hadn't expected, and worked alongside her for the last 40 minutes. And he did not explain why he'd come up or make any comment about it, and she did not ask. They worked side by side in the easy quiet of people who have learned how each other moves, and finished the section as the sun reached the ridgeline, and came down together as the evening began. It was not nothing, that afternoon. She would not have called it nothing. She just also would not have called it anything she had a word for yet. That evening after supper, while she was in the cookhouse, and he was at the table in the front room with his tally books, she heard him say, not loudly, just across the space between rooms, in a tone that was neither warm nor cold, but simply honest. You did good work today. She was quiet for a moment. Thank you, she said. He did not say anything else. Neither did she. But she stood at the cookhouse counter and felt something she had to be careful with because she recognized it as the kind of thing you could overinterpret. That was simply the solid, clean feeling of having been seen accurately, not evaluated against some other standard, not measured against what she was supposed to be, simply seen for what she had actually done. She washed the last of the dishes and put them away, and she did not linger on the feeling because she was a practical woman, and she had learned that lingering on feelings that were fragile was a good way to break them. She went upstairs. She stood at the east window. The stars were out again, as they always were out here in country that had no lamplight to compete with, and the flats were dark and wide and absolutely still. She had been at Iron Ridge Ranch for 3 weeks. She had not thought once about Ash Hollow in any way that hurt. That was not nothing either. There was, however, a thing she had not anticipated, a thing that arrived not in the large dramatic moments, not on the roof, not over the ledger, not in the rain, but in the small, accumulated, ordinary ones. She had not anticipated the mornings. There was a particular quality to the mornings at Iron Ridge that she had no equivalent for in her prior life. In Ash Hollow, mornings had been about managing the cold, managing the day's list, managing the various anxieties that came with the knowledge of what the day would require of you socially. Here, mornings were simply mornings. She rose at 5 and lit the lamp and started the stove, and the ranch was quiet around her. The particular pre-dawn quiet that exists when working people are between sleep and the day's beginning. And she made coffee and stood in the cookhouse doorway with her cup and watched the darkness ease toward gray and then toward color. The land did something at dawn that she had not been prepared for. The light came from behind the ridge to the east, and it arrived in long horizontal bands that made everything look, she searched for the word, provisional. Like the world was being assembled fresh each morning, and the light was showing you the process. The grass went from black to silver to gold, in a sequence that took about 20 minutes, and she had, by the start of the 4th week, begun to think of those 20 minutes as the best part of the day. She did not know that Mercer was sometimes awake and watching during those 20 minutes too, from the window at the end of the upstairs hall that looked east. She did not know that he had stood there more than once with his own coffee, watching not just the light on the grass, but the figure of a woman in the cookhouse doorway who stood straight and still with her cup and looked at the morning like she was reading something important in it. She did not know this. He did not tell her. But it was there all the same. By the end of the 4th week, she had developed what she could only call a relationship with the ranch, not with any of the people on it specifically, but with the place itself. She had begun to understand its rhythms, when the cattle were moved and why, what the particular sound of a horse in distress was as opposed to a horse being dramatic, how to read the sky in the afternoon to predict the evening's weather, which boards in the barn floor were soft and needed avoiding. She had begun to know it the way you only know a place you have worked in and worked with, and the knowing felt like something she had earned rather than something she'd been given. She had not expected to find this. She had expected survival, maybe. She had expected endurance. She had not expected to find that the place itself would hand her back something she had not realized she was missing. One evening toward the end of the month, Jessie Rafferty said something at the supper table that was meant as a joke. Something about how a woman who could fix a roof and keep a ledger was wasted in a kitchen. And she looked at him and he braced for her response, because by now the hands had learned that her responses were rarely what they expected. "I'm not wasted anywhere I choose to be," she said mildly, "and the kitchen isn't lesser than the fence line. It just feeds you." Jessie was quiet. Colt, across the table, covered a grin with his coffee cup. Dex said nothing, but she caught, at the edge of her vision, the small nod he gave, a private, deliberate nod, directed at no one in particular, which she understood as a thing offered to the air on behalf of a sentiment he agreed with but was not going to say out loud. Mercer, at the head of the table, had been looking at his plate. He did not look up, but she saw his jaw shift, just slightly, in the way it did when he was keeping an expression back. She went on eating. She was 31 days into whatever this was. She was sore most evenings. She was perpetually behind on the provision ledger. The stove still ran hot on the left side, and she was still working out how to compensate. She was learning to ride, actually learning now, not just surviving Dolly's patient tolerance. And last Tuesday, she had cantered the length of the south paddock without Dex watching, just her and the horse and the big open sky. She was not happy, exactly. Happiness was too large and too certain a word for what she felt. But she was something that did not have a name yet but was real and growing. And she had not heard anyone laugh at her in 31 days. That was not a small thing. That was, in fact, everything. The 5th week brought something Lenora had not accounted for in any of her preparations. A letter from Cal. Pete Halloran dropped it on his northbound run, tucking it under the cookhouse door in the early morning before anyone was properly awake. And Lenora found it when she came down at 5 to start the stove. She recognized Cal's handwriting immediately, blocky and cramped. The hand of a man who had learned to write adequately, but had never come to enjoy it. And she set her coffee on the work table and opened it there in the lamplight before the ranch had fully woken up. It was not a long letter. Cal was not a man who wrote long letters. 3 paragraphs in his characteristic style, which meant that every sentence carried more weight than it appeared to because he had already discarded everything he considered unnecessary, which was most things. The first paragraph was practical. The goats were fine, the garden was coming in. He'd sold the extra eggs to Mrs. Fletcher at the usual rate. Normal. The second paragraph was less comfortable. The debt situation had not improved, but a man named Alderson had offered him seasonal work at his mill, and he'd taken it, which would help through summer at least. She read this and set it aside to think about later. The third paragraph was the one that made her read it twice. I mentioned your situation to some people here. Word gets around, I suppose. There's a man, Silas Crow, he goes by, who says he knows Mercer's name, or at least knows the region. He is a well-presented man in the business of what he calls social advancement, works mostly with families of limited means who want better prospects. He expressed an interest in your situation specifically. I told him I'd pass along his name. His is not a charity. He charges for his services. But Fletcher's wife says he has a good reputation. I don't know if this is useful to you. I leave it to your judgment. She read it a third time. Then she folded it carefully and put it in her apron pocket, and she started the stove. And she did not think about it with any particular alarm because she was a practical woman and the letter was just a letter. Cal had passed along a name. That was all. But the name stayed with her, Silas Crow, in the way that certain things stay with you not because they're important yet, but because some part of you that's smarter than your conscious mind has filed them under watch this. She did not mention the letter to Mercer. There was no particular reason she would have. It was her mail, her brother, her business. But she was aware of it, in the way you're aware of a door you've closed but not yet decided whether to lock. The 6th week settled over Iron Ridge with the particular heavy weight of full summer, the kind of heat that arrived before dawn and did not lift until well after dark, that made the cattle move slowly and the hands work in shortened bursts, and the evenings feel like a prolonged exhale after the held breath of the day. Lenora adjusted her routine. She started supper earlier, took the provision work to the cool of the cellar in the afternoons, and brought a dampened cloth to the cookhouse to manage the heat at the stove. She was also, by this point, writing well enough that Dex had stopped supervising the morning sessions and simply told her which horse to take and waved her off. This was practical. Mercer had asked her to begin handling the supply runs to the creek crossing, where Pete Halloran left deliveries on alternate Fridays, and the 12-mile round trip required a horse and some confidence on it. The first time she made the run alone was a Thursday, on a gray gelding named Porter who had a smoother gait than Dolly and a tendency to spook at nothing, and she came back with the supply sacks across Porter's back, and Dex met her at the gate with an expression that was as close to impressed as she'd seen from him. "Porter give you trouble?" he said. "He objected to a hawk," she said. "We negotiated." Dex looked at her, then at the horse, then allowed himself a small, slow smile. "Good enough," he said, and took the reins. The relationship between Lenora and Iron Ridge was changing in ways that were difficult to name but impossible to miss. She had found, over 6 weeks, that the ranch had a personality, not in any fanciful sense, but in the practical sense of a place that had been shaped by the particular choices and habits of the people who'd built and maintained it, and that bore the marks of those choices the way a face bears the marks of its expressions. She was beginning to understand those marks, beginning to know the place in the specific granular way that comes only from working in it every day, from noticing which fence line always needed checking after heavy rain, which well bucket had a crack in the handle that would eventually fail, which of the cattle were prone to wandering and which could be trusted. And she was beginning, carefully, without announcement, to improve things. Not in any dramatic fashion. She was not a woman who announced her improvements. She simply noticed what could be better and made it better and let the results speak. The provision seller now had a clear organization with a written inventory posted on the wall. The cookhouse had a new system for fire-making that cut 15 minutes off the morning start time. The household accounts were reconciled weekly rather than monthly, which meant that errors showed up small instead of catastrophic. She had reorganized the linen storage so that the saddle blankets were separate from the house linens, which had apparently never occurred to anyone to do. Mercer noticed these things. She could tell by the way he moved through the spaces she'd organized, the small, barely perceptible pause of a man registering that something is different and better. He did not always comment. Sometimes he did. One morning he came into the cookhouse and looked at the new fire-making arrangement. The kindling sorted by size in a specific order, the flint and steel in a fixed location rather than wherever they'd last been set down. And he was quiet for a moment. "You reorganized the morning fire," he said. "It was faster," she said. "The kindling was never where you'd expect it." He looked at the arrangement. My father did something similar, he said, and then seemed surprised he'd said it and went for his coffee. She did not follow that remark anywhere, but she filed it, in the way she filed things, quietly and without display. It was on a Friday afternoon in the 7th week, when the heat had finally broken and a cool front was moving in from the north, bringing the particular clean smell that precedes rain, that the rider came down the ranch road. She was in the yard, coming back from the root cellar with an armful of preserved goods, when she heard hoofbeats and looked up. A single rider on a good horse, chestnut, well kept, nothing like the working animals of Iron Ridge. The rider himself was equally well presented. Even at a distance she could see the quality of the coat, the hat at a considered angle, the upright posture of a man who has given his appearance consistent and deliberate attention. He came through the gate and into the yard and pulled up with the ease of an experienced rider, and he looked at her with a smile that was precisely calibrated, warm but not too warm, interested but not presumptuous. And she recognized immediately that this was a man who had spent considerable time learning how to produce exactly this impression. "Good afternoon," he said. "I'm looking for Iron Ridge Ranch. I hope I found it." "You have," she said. "Wonderful." He dismounted in a single smooth motion. He was perhaps 40, or somewhere near it, dark-haired going silver at the temples, clean-shaved, with the kind of regular features that were conventionally handsome in a way that seemed almost too considered, like a face assembled by committee. He extended a hand. Silas Crow. She did not move for a moment, just long enough to be sure. Then she transferred the goods to one arm and shook his hand briefly. Lenora Pike. Something in his expression shifted. A small brightening, recognition. "Miss Pike, Cal Brenner's sister." "That's right." "Well." He seemed genuinely pleased, in the way of a man who considers coincidence to be a sign of the rightness of his endeavors. "I'd hoped to speak with you. Your brother mentioned your situation. I was making a run through this region, and I thought, if I was passing close enough, I would stop in." He gestured at the ranch around them with an appreciative air. "This is impressive country." "It's a working ranch," she said. "Mr. Mercer's in the East Field today, if you need to speak with him." "Oh, I have no business with Mr. Mercer. It's you I've come to see if you have a few minutes." She looked at him steadily. She was carrying preserved goods in one arm, and she was standing in a ranch yard in a work apron, and she had been, before his arrival, thinking about whether the rain tonight was going to require repositioning the water barrel under the east eave. She was not, in any way she could identify, in need of being seen by this man. "I have a few minutes," she said. "Come up to the porch." She set the goods inside the front door and came back out. And they sat. She in the working chair she used when she shelled peas on the porch. He in the guest chair that nobody ever used. And she waited for him to say what he'd come to say. Silas Crow had the practiced fluency of a man who sold things for a living. He began with some general remarks about the country and the season and the quality of the roads, which she understood as the warm-up, the establishing of tone before the actual thing began. She let him have it. She had dealt with enough salesmen at the Ash Hollow market to know that the preamble was part of the product, and that cutting it off prematurely only made the man work harder to recapture it. After perhaps 4 minutes of pleasant generality, he said, "I imagine your brother shared a little of what I do." "He mentioned you work with families of limited means," she said. "Something about social advancement. That's a fair summary." He leaned forward with his elbows on his knees. A practiced gesture, she thought, that was designed to communicate engagement and confidence simultaneously. "What I do, specifically, is help women in situations like yours. Intelligent women, capable women, women who've been placed by circumstance in environments that don't reflect their actual worth. I help them access a different tier of social opportunity. I have connections in several towns, in better established communities. Families looking for companions, educators, housekeepers in quality households. And occasionally," he paused with professional delicacy, "matrimonial connections, with men of means and standing. Matrimonial connections," she said. "Introductions, rather. I facilitate introductions. What comes of them is, of course, entirely between the parties." She considered him. "And in exchange?" "A modest fee, structured to be accessible, and in some cases, a portion of whatever advancement results." He spread his hands in a gesture of reasonableness. "I'm not operating a charity, but I'm also not charging what the service is worth. My reputation depends on results." She was quiet for a moment. The cool air from the north was picking up now, moving through the yard, carrying the smell of coming rain. "What makes you think," she said, "that I need your services?" He did not flinch. He had clearly been asked this question before, in various forms. "Nothing about your situation here suggests inadequacy," he said smoothly. "You appear capable, and I'm sure Mr. Mercer values your help. But I've been in this work long enough to recognize when a woman's circumstances are," another delicate pause, "temporary by nature, and there are options available to you that you may not be aware of." "What kind of options?" He smiled. "The kind that begin with presentation, the way a woman carries herself, presents herself, the impression she makes. These are skills, Miss Pike, and skills can be taught. I have a colleague in Milford. It's a prosperous town, about 90 miles east of here, who runs what I can only describe as a refinement program. 8 weeks. Deportment, manner, dress, social skills. Women who complete it come out prepared for a genuinely different quality of life." He paused. "The connections I can offer in Milford are substantial. Men who own property, who have standing, men who are looking for a capable, steady woman, but who are also—" And here was where she felt the conversation arrive at its real destination, looking for a certain kind of presentation. She was quiet for a longer moment this time. A refinement program. Deportment. Manner. Dress. A certain kind of presentation. She had, in 23 years, become fluent in the coded language of this particular category of thing. She could translate it with her eyes closed. "You are not the problem, but your body is. Fix the body, and we'll find you something worthwhile." The anger came, but it came quietly. The way her anger usually came. Not as heat, but as a cold, clarifying thing that made everything very precise. "I see," she said. "I want to be clear. I'm not suggesting anything is wrong with you as you are," he said, and he had the fluency to mean it almost convincingly. "It's simply that the world responds to certain signals, and learning to send those signals is an act of intelligence, not vanity." He leaned back. "You're a smart woman. I could tell that in the first 2 minutes. Smart women understand that working within the system, rather than against it, produces better outcomes. And you've had success with this," she said. "Women who've gone through your program." "Several. One married a merchant in Milford. Another is companion to a landowner's wife in Cedar Falls. Very comfortable situation. And one," he allowed himself a small note of pride, "married a judge. A circuit judge." "Good for her," Lenora said. "Indeed." He smiled. "I'm not promising anything specific to you, of course, but I'm promising genuine opportunity, something different from—" He glanced briefly at the ranch around them, at the plain yard and the working buildings, and the sky going dark to the north. "This." She looked at him. At the quality coat and the considered hat and the practiced smile. She thought about the market square in Ash Hollow and Mortondale's grunt and the women who turned away. She thought about 7 years of making herself smaller than she was to accommodate other people's comfort. She thought about what it had cost her, all that accommodation, and what it had bought. She thought about the east window and the morning light on the grass. She thought about the ledger, reorganized in a way that actually worked. She thought about Dolly and then Porter and the 12 miles to the creek crossing she now did alone without thinking twice. She thought about standing on a roof in the rain and Rowan Mercer on the porch steps below her saying, "I see that," in a voice that meant something she was still working out. She thought about what Silas Crow was actually offering her, underneath the smooth delivery and the reasonable-sounding language. He was offering her the chance to become a more acceptable version of herself, to sand down the parts that didn't fit and present the remainder in a better frame. She was not, she discovered in that moment, interested. "Mr. Crow," she said, "I appreciate you riding out here. I can see you've gone to some effort." "Not at all," he said, readying himself for the continuation. "But I think your program is designed for a different kind of problem than the one I have." She kept her voice even and pleasant. "The women who benefit from what you're describing, I'd guess they're women who believe the judgment is accurate, that there's something about them that needs correcting in order to deserve a good life." She paused. "I don't believe that about myself. It took me a long time not to, but I got there, and I'm not inclined to go back." The smile remained, but it adjusted slightly, recalibrated for a different kind of resistance. "I understand that perspective," he said, "and I respect it. But respectfully, what you're calling confidence can sometimes be a way of protecting yourself from—" "It can be," she agreed, "but in this case it isn't." A beat. You seem very certain, he said. I am. He studied her for a moment with the genuine assessment of a man trying to determine whether this was a no he could work with. She held his gaze without any particular effort. She had held more difficult gazes than this. Well, he sat back and produced the graceful retreat of a man who had learned that the strategic withdrawal preserved future possibility. I won't push where I'm not wanted, but I'll leave you my card in case your thinking changes. You can leave it, she said. But I want to be honest with you. My thinking won't change. This isn't a decision I'm making in a bad mood or on a difficult day. It's just what I think. He left the card anyway. She took it because refusing it would have been a performance, and she was not interested in performing. After he'd ridden out through the gate and down the road, she sat on the porch for a while in the cooling air and the smell of rain that was now very close. She turned the card over in her fingers. Good cardstock, professionally printed, Silas Crow, Social Advancement and Placement Services, with an address in Milford. She was aware that she was shaking slightly. Not from fear. From something that had no clean name, a compound thing, anger and grief, and something that might have been relief, all happening at the same time. Because the offer had been real. That was the thing she had to sit with. Silas Crow was not entirely wrong about the world. He was right that the world responded to certain signals, right that the game had rules, right that women who learned the rules had a better time navigating the outcomes. He was not wrong about any of that. He was just wrong about the cost being worth paying. The door behind her opened. She had not heard Mercer come back from the East Field, but she should have. She'd been sitting here long enough. He came out onto the porch and stopped when he saw her, and then he looked out at the road in the direction the rider had gone, and then back at her. Who was that? He said. A man named Crow, she said. He had a business proposition. Mercer looked at her, at the card in her hand. What kind of proposition? She considered how to answer that. Then she held up the card and read it. Social Advancement and Placement Services. A pause. And? I declined. He was quiet for a moment. She could feel him working out whether to ask more, in the specific way he had of managing his own curiosity, holding it at arm's length until he decided it was his business to pursue. Was it a poor offer, he said finally, or just not what you wanted? She thought about it. Both, she said. He nodded. He looked at the darkening sky. The first drops of rain were beginning to fall, light and preliminary, the kind that comes before the main event. You should get the barrel under the east eave, she said. I know, he said. But he didn't move to do it immediately. He stood on the porch, and she sat in the working chair, and the rain began to fall in earnest, and neither of them said anything for a while. She did not know what he'd heard. She did not know how long he'd been inside, whether he'd caught any part of the conversation with Crow, whether the word refinement or presentation or certain kind of woman had come through the walls. She did not ask. Some things were better not followed to their source, but he was standing there, in the rain, not going to get the barrel, just standing. Pike, he said. She looked at him. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the rain coming down in the yard, at the puddles already forming in the low spots. I need to tell you something, he said. She waited. When Halloran first told me about the arrangement, the position. He stopped, started again. I wasn't entirely straight about what I was looking for. I told Pete I needed a housekeeper. That was true. But there was more to it than that. He turned and looked at her now, and he had the expression of a man delivering something he'd been carrying for a while and was glad to put down, even if the putting down was uncomfortable. I was also thinking about what Pete called the longer arrangement, the permanent one. She looked at him. I know, she said. He seemed surprised. Cal told you? Cal told me it was a possibility, she said. He was careful about it, but he told me. And you came anyway. I needed to leave, she said. And this was a real job. Whatever else it might have been or might not have been, it was real work. She looked at him steadily. I didn't come here expecting anything. I want you to know that. He nodded slowly. I want you to know that I'm... He paused, apparently looking for the right word with some difficulty. I'm not the kind of man who arranged this as a trap. I didn't have a clear idea what I wanted. I just knew that the ranch needed managing properly, and that I was... Another pause. Longer. I was tired of managing it alone. She said nothing. She could feel the weight of the rain, the particular intimacy of a conversation being had under a roof while the world outside was wet. That's all I'm saying, he said. I'm not saying anything beyond that. All right, she said. All right. He looked at the rain again. Then he went off the porch into it, walking to the east side of the house to deal with the barrel, getting wet without any apparent concern about it. She sat in the chair and looked at the rain and held Silas Crow's card in her hand and thought about everything that had happened in the last 2 hours. She thought about Crow's offer, about the refinement program, and the 8 weeks and the men of means and standing in Milford who were looking for a certain kind of presentation, about the circuit judge's wife, who was presumably comfortable and presumably acceptable, and presumably had paid a price for that acceptability that was now so routine she probably didn't think about it anymore. She thought about what it would have meant once, if Crow had appeared in Ash Hollow 5 years ago, on a day when she was coming out of the market, having heard Dale's grunt and the women's laughter. If he'd appeared then with his smooth presentation and his reasonable language, she thought it was possible she might have listened differently. She thought about how much had changed in 6 weeks. It was not Rowan Mercer, she told herself. It was not any one person. It was the accumulation of days in which she had been required to simply be what she was, to apply herself to concrete tasks and be judged on whether the task got done. And she had discovered, not as a revelation but as a slow, steady growing certainty, that she was more than adequate, that she was, in fact, genuinely good at this life. Not because it was easy, but because it demanded exactly the things she had, and the things she had turned out to be worth demanding. The barrel, the ledger, the roof. 12 miles on Porter without a second thought. She was worth more than Silas Crow's program could offer, and the reason she knew it now when she hadn't known it 5 years ago was that she had spent 6 weeks being treated like a person who was worth something. She put the card in her apron pocket. She would throw it in the fire tonight, not dramatically, just because it was a piece of paper she had no use for. Mercer came back around the side of the house, damp now, and went up the porch steps and through the front door without pausing, and she heard him in the hall, heard the sounds of him dealing with his wet coat. She got up and went inside. She started supper. Behind her the rain fell on the new cedar shingles of the roof she had helped repair, and the roof held, and nothing leaked. It was a small thing. It was also, in the way of small things that are actually the point, everything. The next morning was clear, the world rinsed and bright after the rain, the grass catching the early light in a way that was almost unbearable in its cleanness. She stood in the cookhouse doorway with her coffee, as she always did, and looked at it. She heard Mercer's boots on the stairs. She knew his step now, as you always learn the particular step of someone you live in the same structure with. And then the front door. And then he was in the yard, heading for the barn. He passed within 20 feet of the cookhouse doorway, and he glanced at her, and she was looking at the light on the grass. And when she felt his glance and turned, he looked away first. She watched him walk toward the barn. She watched the way he moved, the unhurried, purposeful walk of a man who knew where he was going and saw no point in performing urgency about it. She thought, I'm not going anywhere. Not as a declaration, not as a decision she was announcing to herself, just as a fact, settling into place the way facts do when they've been true for a while and you finally looked at them directly. She was not going anywhere. And the thing about that, the thing that was so different from every other time she'd stayed somewhere, was that she was not staying out of fear or default or the absence of options. She was staying because she had looked at what was here and decided it was worth staying for. She drank her coffee. The light came up over the ridge in its long horizontal bands. Somewhere in the barn, a horse made its morning sound. The day was starting. She went back inside to make breakfast. 3 days after the rain, Crow came back. She was in the yard splitting kindling when she heard the hoofbeats, and she knew before she looked up. Something in the particular rhythm of that chestnut horse, unhurried and deliberate, the gait of an animal that had been trained to present well. She set the hatchet in the block and straightened and watched him come through the gate. How was, if anything, more composed than the first visit. The coat was the same quality. The hat was a different one, which meant he traveled with more than one, which meant he was a man who considered his presentation worth the extra weight on a trip. She noticed these things the way she noticed provision tallies, not because she was looking for them specifically, but because noticing was how she moved through the world. "Miss Pike," he said, dismounting with the same practiced ease. "Mr. Crow." She did not offer anything beyond the acknowledgement. "I hope I'm not intruding." He said it in the tone of a man who had calculated that he was not intruding in any way that would cause real difficulty. "What brings you back?" she said. Not a question exactly. more of an invitation to arrive at the point. "I've been thinking about our conversation," he said. He looped his reins over the fence post with the ease of someone comfortable making himself at home. "I want to be honest with you. I don't often have conversations like that one." "Like what kind?" "Where I come away uncertain." He looked at her directly. "Most women in your situation, they either want what I'm offering or they're afraid of it. You were neither, and I've been turning that over." She picked up the hatchet again, not as a threat, just because she had work to do and did not see why his return should stop it. She set another piece of kindling on the block. "I was clear with you," she said. "My position hasn't changed. I know." He watched her split the piece cleanly, the two halves falling apart. "That's not why I came back." He paused, and she heard in the pause a recalculation, a shifting of approach that he was choosing to make visible, which was itself a technique. "I came back because I think I presented myself poorly the first time. I made it sound like a transformation scheme, a way of making someone into something they're not." "That's what it sounded like because that's what it was," she said mildly. "It's more complicated than that." "It might be." She set another piece on the block. "But the part that applies to me wasn't." He was quiet for a moment. She split the piece and added the halves to the growing pile. "There's a family in Milford," he said. "The Hargreaves. Theodore Hargreaves. He runs the grain exchange, substantial business, well regarded. His wife died 2 years ago. He has a son, 12 years old, and a household that needs management, real management, the kind that requires someone capable." He paused. "He's a reasonable man. Not young, 52, but solid. And he's asked me specifically to find someone capable rather than merely presentable." Those were his words. She split another piece of kindling. She did not look up. "I thought of you when he said it," Crow continued, "because capable is exactly what you are. Whatever else I may have gotten wrong about you the first time, I didn't get that wrong." She set the hatchet in the block. She looked at him. "You're describing a different offer than the one you made before." "I am." "Why?" He seemed for the first time slightly less polished. "Because I'm good at my work," he said, "and the first offer was wrong for you. And being wrong about a client costs me eventually, even if it doesn't cost me immediately." He held her gaze. "Hargreaves is a good man. I believe that. And you're a capable woman who's living 40 miles from anywhere on a working ranch where, forgive me, the long-term prospects are uncertain." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about Theodore Hargreaves, 52, with his grain exchange and his motherless boy, and his word capable repeated back to her through a middleman. She thought about what it would mean. A prosperous town, a settled household, a man who apparently wanted something real rather than something decorative. She thought about Mercer's voice saying I was tired of managing it alone. She thought about the morning light on the grass and the east window, and Porter's smooth gait on the creek road and Dex's quiet nod across the supper table. "The prospects here are not as uncertain as you think," she said. Something shifted in his expression, a small, genuine readjustment. "I see," he said. "I don't think you do," she said. "But that's all right." She picked up the hatchet again. "I appreciate you coming back. I think your Hargreaves offer is probably a good one for the right person. But I'm not the right person, Mr. Crow. Not because of the reasons you thought the first time, because I'm already where I'm supposed to be." He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the ranch around her, the plain yard, the working buildings, the pen where 2 horses stood in the afternoon heat, the long fence lines running out to the horizon. "This," he said. "Yes," she said, "this." He untied his reins from the fence post. He mounted with the same practiced ease and settled himself in the saddle and looked at her one more time. There was, in his expression, something she hadn't expected. Not contempt, not pity, but a kind of genuine puzzlement, the look of a man who has encountered something that doesn't fit his categories and is not sure where to put it. "You're an unusual woman, Miss Pike," he said. "I know," she said. He rode out through the gate. She watched him go. Then she turned back to the kindling block and worked through the remaining pile until it was done. She was stacking the split wood against the wall when she became aware that she was not alone. She turned and Mercer was there, coming from the direction of the barn, and he had clearly seen at least the tail end of the departure, Crow's figure on the chestnut horse going down the ranch road, and he stopped when he saw her looking at him. "He came back," Mercer said. "He had a better offer this time," she said. "A widower in Milford with a grain exchange and a 12-year-old boy." Mercer's expression did not change in any large way, but something in it tightened. And I told him I was already where I was supposed to be. She set the last of the split wood in place and dusted off her hands. She looked at him directly, the way she did most things. I thought you should know that, since it involves your ranch and your arrangement. He was quiet for a moment in the way he was always quiet. Not empty, but full. Working through something. It doesn't only involve the ranch, he said. The afternoon held very still around them. Somewhere far across the flats a hawk was moving, barely visible, a dark point against the pale sky. No, she said. I know that. He looked at her and she looked at him, and neither of them said anything. For what was probably 15 seconds, but felt longer, the kind of silence that has weight and temperature and that you remember afterward because of those qualities. Then he said, "Come look at the east water line with me. There's a section I want your opinion on." "All right," she said. She fell into step beside him and they walked toward the east fence in the late afternoon light, and they did not talk about Silas Crow or Theodore Hargreaves or Milford or any of it, because there was a water line to look at, and that was the real business of the place. And they were both people who understood that real business did not wait on emotional resolution. She looked at the water line. She gave her opinion. He listened to it with the same specific quality of attention he always gave her, the kind that meant he was actually thinking about what she said rather than simply waiting for her to finish. They walked back as the sun reached the ridge and the day began its descent. And when they reached the porch, she went inside to start supper, and he went to the barn for the evening round of the livestock, and the ranch settled into its evening rhythm the way it always did. It was ordinary. It was also the day she understood with complete clarity that she had made her choice. What she had not anticipated was that the choice, once made, would have to be remade. That it would not be a single decision that held, but something that needed to be reaffirmed, because the world was not finished testing it yet. Cal arrived on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after Crow's second visit. She did not know he was coming. He had not written ahead. Cal was the kind of man who decided things and then acted on them without much intermediate communication, always had been, and she'd spent 23 years on the receiving end of this habit and had made her peace with it, mostly. He came on Pete Halloran's wagon, which was the only practical transport, and she saw him from the cookhouse window when she was making the noon meal. His familiar silhouette descending from the wagon box, the particular slope of his shoulders that she'd known her whole life. She felt a quick, complex thing move through her chest, warmth and wariness simultaneously, the combination that has characterized many reunions between siblings who love each other and also cause each other regular difficulty. She dried her hands and went out to the yard. "Cal," she said. "Lenora." He looked at her the way he always did when he'd been away from her for a while, as though recalibrating. She wondered what he saw. She felt standing there that she probably looked different than she had in Ash Hollow, though she couldn't have said exactly how. "Why didn't you write ahead?" she said. "I wanted to see for myself," he said, which was honest at least. "Come inside," she said. "The noon meal's almost ready." She fed him in the cookhouse. It was past the hands' mealtime, so it was just the two of them, and he ate with the quiet concentration of a man who has been traveling and is hungry, and she gave him time to settle before anything else. She had learned, over years, that Cal was easier to talk to when he had food in him and some sense of the room he was in. He looked around the cookhouse, at the organized shelves, the inventory posted on the wall, the efficient arrangement of the work surfaces. He looked at it the way Mercer had looked at the reorganized fire-making, with the slight pause of recognition. "You've been busy," he said. "It needed doing," she said. "It looks—" He seemed to search for the word. "Good. It looks good." She poured coffee and sat across from him. Outside, through the cookhouse window, she could see the yard and the fence lines and the edge of the barn. She watched Cal look at it, at the scope of it, the working solidity of the place. "It's bigger than I expected," he said. "It's a substantial operation," she said. "Mercer." He said the name with the careful neutrality of a man who has an opinion he's not sure whether to share. "Is he— How is he?" "He's a good man," she said simply. "And he runs this place well." Cal looked at his coffee. "Pete said you've been riding." "Learning to. I manage the supply runs to the creek crossing now." He looked up at that. Something in his expression shifted, something she recognized as surprise at the specific quality of what she'd said rather than at the fact of it. Not just Lenora rides a horse now, but Lenora runs supply operations for a cattle ranch. She could see him placing this against whatever image of her he'd traveled 40 miles carrying. You seem... He stopped. What? Different, he said. Not in a bad way, just different. I am different, she said. He turned his coffee cup in both hands, a habit she'd known since childhood. He did it when he was approaching something he'd decided he had to say, but wasn't sure of the landing. Crow came to see you, he said. Twice, she said. He looked up. Twice. He came back with a better offer the second time. A man in Milford, a widower. He thought I might be more interested in something that didn't require, she chose her words, modification. Were you? No. Cal set down the coffee cup. He put his hands flat on the table. Lenora, he said, in the particular tone that meant he was about to say something he'd rehearsed. I'm not here to push you toward Crow or Milford or any of it. I want to be clear about that. That's not why I came. Then why did you come? Because I wanted to know if you're all right, he said. Actually all right. Not just managing. Not just making do. He looked at her. I know what I did. Sending you out here the way I did, without asking you properly, without making it your choice from the start. I know what that was. She looked at her brother, at the worn face and the tired eyes and the hands that had worked since he was 22 and had never quite gotten ahead of what was required. She thought about the night she'd sat at the kitchen table with 2 columns on a piece of paper, and what had been in each column, and what it had taken to fold the paper and put it in her pocket and sleep. You were trying to solve a problem, she said. You did it wrong, but you were trying. That's generous. It's accurate, she said. I'm not generous about it. You went around me, Cal. You made an arrangement about my life before you told me there was an arrangement to be made. That was wrong. She held his eyes. But it also brought me here. And here has turned out to be... She paused. Not what I expected. Better than I expected. In ways I couldn't have told you ahead of time. He looked at her carefully. Because of the work. Yes, because of the work. She paused again. And other things. Cal was not an unperceptive man. He had the particular perceptiveness of a person who has spent a lot of time watching someone they love carefully, trying to understand what they needed and repeatedly falling slightly short of actually providing it. He looked at her face and she could see him reading it, the way a man reads terrain he's walked before but finds subtly altered. Mercer, he said. Not as a question. It's not your business yet, she said. If it becomes your business, I'll tell you. Something in his expression. A small release, like a tension he hadn't known he was holding. All right, he said. She refilled his coffee. They sat in a companionable quiet for a while, the kind they'd had before everything got complicated, and she was glad he was here, she realized, genuinely glad, the warmth in her chest resolving into something cleaner than the wariness had been. How are things in Ash Hollow? She said. Same, he said. Dale's still Dale. Mrs. Fletcher asks after you. She's a decent woman. She is. He paused. The debt's better. Alderson's mill is steady work. I think we'll get clear of it by winter. Good, she said, and meant it. He left the next morning, Pete Halloran collecting him at 6:30 on the southbound run. She stood in the yard and said goodbye, and he held her by the shoulders for a moment and looked at her and then pulled her in briefly, the way men who are not given to physical affection do when they are moved, awkwardly and then quickly, as if they need to complete the gesture before it embarrasses them. Write more, she said. I will, he said, which meant he would try. She watched the wagon go down the ranch road and then turned back toward the cookhouse. Mercer was on the porch. He had been tactful during Cal's visit, present for meals, civil and composed, without making anything awkward or complicated. She had been aware of him managing his own presence carefully, giving her and Cal space, and she had appreciated it in a way she hadn't quite found words for. Your brother's a decent man, he said, which was about the most she would have expected from him by way of commentary. He's a complicated man, she said. But yes, decent. She went inside to clean up the breakfast things. He went to the barn. The day continued the way days did at Iron Ridge, the work generating its own momentum, its own requirements, its own small accomplishments, and minor frustrations. She was at the work table that afternoon, working through the quarterly provision accounts, when she heard the front door and then Mercer's step in the hall, which was early. It was barely 3 in the afternoon, and he rarely came in before evening. She heard him stop in the doorway between the hall and the front room, and then she heard nothing, which meant he was standing there and she could not hear him sitting down. After a moment, Pike. She set down her pen. Yes, come out here a minute. She wiped her hands and went through to the front room. He was standing by the window that looked out toward the north, and he turned when she came in. He had the expression he got when he was about to say something he hadn't practiced. Not the rehearsed quality of a man who has decided what to say and is delivering it, but the uncomfortable openness of someone speaking directly from the place where the feeling was. I want to say something, he said, and I want to say it plainly, because I don't have another way to say it. She folded her hands in front of her. She waited. I was not prepared for you, he said. I want to be honest about that. When Pete described the arrangement, I had an idea of what would come. Someone capable of managing the house. Someone who would hold things together on the domestic side. He paused. I did not expect someone who would notice the root cellar wall and redesign the provision ledger and get on a roof in the rain and tell Silas Crow twice to his face that she wasn't interested. He stopped. He was looking at her directly, not away. I did not expect to find myself. He stopped again, and she could see the precise discomfort of a man who is not given to this kind of statement and is making himself do it anyway, looking forward to supper. She looked at him. Looking forward to supper, she repeated. Because you're there, he said. That's what I mean, not the food. He said it with a flatness that was not coldness, but simply the particular way he stated things when he was very serious about them. She was quiet for a moment. She thought about what was true. She thought about what it cost him to say what he'd just said, given everything she'd come to understand about how he held himself, the distance he'd maintained between himself and the world, the solitude that had gone structural after years of being the only option. She thought about the morning she'd first arrived and the directness of his look, and the way he'd said, I see that, when she'd caught the shingle on the roof. She thought about standing at the east window, and the way she'd known, that morning after Crow's second visit, that she was not going anywhere. I know what you mean, she said. He looked at her carefully. Do you? Yes, she said. Another silence, shorter this time. I'm not a man who says things easily, he said. I want you to know that what I'm saying is, it's not offered lightly. I know that too, she said. I've been paying attention. Something in him shifted. Not dramatically. Not the kind of shift that makes itself known in large gestures. More like a door opening in a space where the air had been still for a long time. He breathed. All right, he said. All right, she said. They stood in the front room for another moment. Outside the north window, the afternoon light was doing what it did at this hour. Going gold and long, the shadows reaching, the fence lines casting thin, dark lines across the pale grass. The quarterly accounts are on the table, she said. I've been reconciling. Do you want to look at them this evening? Yes, he said. After supper. She went back to the cookhouse. She could hear him in the front room. The sound of him settling into the chair, the rustle of papers, the ordinary sounds of a man resuming his afternoon in a house that was, whether they'd said so plainly or not, becoming something it had not been before. She started supper. It was nothing elaborate. She rarely was elaborate, but she was careful with it, the way she was careful with things that mattered. She cooked, and the ranch settled around her into its evening mode, the light going amber through the cookhouse window, the hands coming in from the fields, the horses in the barn making their end-of-day sounds. Dex came in for water and stood at the cookhouse door and looked at her with the specific look he occasionally got, the one she'd come to understand as his version of checking in, the closest he came to asking you all right without actually asking it. Good day, he said. Good day, she said. He nodded and went. Jessie Rafferty came in next, trailing mud from the lower pasture, and she pointed at his boots before he'd taken 3 steps, and he stopped and looked down, and then looked at her with the expression of a man who is routinely caught out by the same thing and continues to be surprised by it. Outside, she said. Yes, ma'am, he said without argument, which was one of the small victories that had accumulated over the weeks into something she considered a reasonable working relationship. She served supper and they ate, all of them, Mercer at the head of the table, Dex and Marsh on one side, the Rafferty brothers on the other, and herself at the foot where she'd settled naturally in the second week without anyone designating it. and the conversation was the usual mix of day's work and weather and tomorrow's tasks. The unremarkable content of people who share a common purpose. But Mercer caught her eye once, across the length of the table, and it was brief. Just a moment, and it said nothing specific and everything general, and she held it for exactly as long as it took to acknowledge it, and then she went back to her supper. Marsh, who noticed everything from behind his silence, picked up his coffee cup with the very small movement that was, she had learned, his particular expression of approval. She was not sure he knew she'd learned to read it. She suspected he did. After supper, she and Mercer sat at the table with the quarterly accounts between them, and they worked through them the way they'd learned to work through things together. She laying out what she'd found, he adding the operational context, both of them arriving at something more accurate than either could have produced alone. It was late when they finished. The lamp was burning low. Outside, the ranch was long since quiet. He rolled up the account sheets and she gathered the loose pages, and the house was very still around them. "Thank you," he said. He said it the way he said most things, simply, without weight beyond its actual weight. Which was, she had come to understand, how he showed things that mattered, not by amplifying them, but by saying them plainly. "You're welcome," she said. She went upstairs. She stood at the east window as she always did. The flat's dark, the stars out, the familiar vast quiet of a place that had no light for miles in any direction to compete with the sky. She thought about Cal on the wagon going south. She thought about Silas Crow on his chestnut horse. She thought about the ledger and the roof and Dex's nod and the morning light coming over the ridge. She thought about looking forward to supper, said in a flat voice by a man who was not capable of flattery and therefore could not have been engaging in it. She thought about what this was becoming. She did not try to rush it or name it or secure it. It was what it was, and it was growing in its own time, in the particular organic way of things that are real rather than performed. She had not earned it by being anything other than herself, and she would not maintain it by being anything other than herself. And that, the completeness of that, the clean simplicity of it, was the most unfamiliar thing she had ever experienced. She was 23 years old, and she was, for the first time in her memory, exactly where she was. She got into bed. The ranch was quiet around her. The stars were brilliant through the east window. She did not think about Ash Hollow. She did not think about what was behind her. She thought about tomorrow's provision run, about the section of east fence that Mercer wanted her opinion on, about the new horse Dex was breaking and whether she was ready to try him, about the morning light, which would come again in a few hours over the ridge, turning the grass from silver to gold in its slow 20-minute way. She was still. She was here. She slept. Autumn came to Iron Ridge the way it came to all of that open country. Not gradually, but in a single decisive turn, like a page. One week the mornings were merely cool, the kind of cool that burned off by midday and left the afternoon warm and useful. The next week the cold came down from the north and stayed, the grass going from gold to brown overnight, the sky taking on that particular high-altitude clarity that made everything look closer and sharper than it actually was. Lenora had been at Iron Ridge for 4 months. She knew this not because she'd been counting, she hadn't, not deliberately, but because the provision ledger told her, in its way. The quarterly reconciliation she'd done with Mercer that night at the lamplit table had been the first she'd managed from start to finish, and it had been cleaner than any previous quarter on record, which she knew because Mercer had said so, flatly and without elaboration, which was his manner of paying the highest compliments. 4 months. It did not feel like 4 months. It felt in some ways like she had always been here, and in other ways, specific, irreducible ways, it felt like she was still arriving, still finding new rooms in the place, new edges to the work, new calibrations in the relationships that had grown up around her in this time. She was riding Porter every morning now. Not for lessons, that had concluded, formally, about 6 weeks in, when Dex had looked at her on a particular morning and said, "You don't need me for this anymore," and walked away from the pen with the economy of a man who does not make ceremonies out of things. She rode for the work, the supply runs, the fence checks she'd begun doing on the east line, the occasional task that took her out into the broader country of the ranch in a way that was, she recognized, a small, ongoing astonishment to her. She had grown up walking everywhere, the sensation of covering ground on horseback, the speed of it, the height of it, the way the country opened up differently from up there, had not entirely lost its novelty. The hands had settled into something she could only call a working family, with all the specificity and imperfection that phrase implied. Dex was the steadiest of them, the one she relied on when she needed to know something about the operational side of the ranch that Mercer hadn't told her yet. Marsh remained quiet and consistent, and she had developed, over the weeks, a genuine respect for his silence. Not the aggressive silence of a man hiding something, but the earned silence of someone who had found that most things did not need to be said, and that the ones that did could be said in very few words. Jesse Rafferty had surprised her. She hadn't expected to like him, not after those early weeks of maneuvering and commentary. But Jesse had a quality she'd come to recognize over time. He was a young man who was performing toughness over the top of a genuine softness. And once she stopped engaging with the performance and started engaging with the thing underneath it, he'd responded in kind. He was, she'd found, genuinely funny when he wasn't trying to be, and genuinely kind when he thought no one was watching. And when his younger brother Colt cut his hand badly on a piece of wire in the 7th week, Jesse had been the one to stay up with him through the night while the wound was cleaned and bandaged. And she'd seen that, and it had settled something in her estimation of him. Colt himself was probably her favorite of them, though she would not have said so. He was the youngest, 19, and he had an honesty to him that was unguarded in a way the others weren't, a directness that sometimes got him into trouble and sometimes said the thing that nobody else was going to say. It was Colt who had asked her, one evening in the 8th week, with the perfect casualness of someone who'd been holding the question for a while and had finally run out of patience with holding it. "Are you going to stay?" She had looked at him across the supper table. "Yes," she said. He nodded, as if she'd confirmed something he'd already decided. "Good," he said, and went back to his meal. Mercer had been looking at his plate during this exchange. She had not looked at him, but she'd been aware of him the way you're always aware of the person in a room that matters most to you, peripherally, constantly, with a quality of attention that doesn't require looking directly. The thing between them had grown in the way of things that are not hurried. There was no single moment she could point to as a turning point. Or rather, there were several, each one modest in itself, each one part of an accumulation. The evening after Cal's visit when he'd told her plainly what he meant. The morning a week after that when she'd been in the provision cellar and had come up to find him in the cookhouse making coffee, which he'd never done before. She'd always had it ready when he came in, and he'd handed her a cup without any particular comment, as though this were simply a thing he did now, handed her coffee. The afternoon when she'd been at the table going over the winter supply calculations, and he'd come in and sat across from her without invitation or explanation and worked through his own tallies in companionable silence for an hour and a half. Small things, consistent things, the kind that meant more than large dramatic declarations because they required daily renewal, daily choice, daily willingness. She was not a woman who took that for granted. She knew what it cost a person to choose something every day. She had been doing it herself, choosing this place, this work, this version of her life, in every morning's decision to get up and start the stove and engage with what was here, and she understood that the value of a commitment was in its repetition, not its announcement. What she had not entirely managed to prepare herself for was the moment the past showed up again with different intentions. It was a Friday in October when the second letter from Cal arrived. This one was longer than the first, and she knew immediately, from the density of his handwriting on the page, from the fact that he'd used both sides, that it contained something significant. She read it at the cookhouse table with her morning coffee before anyone else was up. He wrote about the mill work and the debt, and Mrs. Fletcher and the rosebush, which had bloomed again in late September, one last stubborn effort before winter. He wrote about Pete Halloran's new wagon and the early frost that had hit the valley. He wrote these things in his usual compact way, each sentence carrying its load without excess. Then he wrote about Silas Crow. "I saw Crow again last week. He came through Ash Hollow on his southbound route and stopped at the mill. I didn't seek him out. It was incidental. He mentioned he'd visited you twice and that you'd declined his offer both times. He wasn't unkind about it. He said something I've been sitting with since. He said you were one of the most certain people he'd encountered in his work. He said certain in the way he meant it as a professional observation, not flattery. I've been thinking about what that means. I've been thinking about the fact that when I made the arrangement with Pete, I was not thinking about what you were certain of. I was thinking about what I was afraid of, that we would run out of options, that I would fail you the way I felt I'd been failing, that some door would close if I didn't move fast. I moved fast, and I went around you, and I told myself it was for your benefit, when the truth is, it was as much for mine. I think you knew that. I think you've known it longer than I have. I wanted to say it plainly because it's been sitting on me, and I don't think sitting on it is doing either of us any good." She read the paragraph 3 times. Then she read the rest of the letter, which was briefer. He was thinking of coming out again for the winter provision delivery, if Mercer would permit it, and she'd have him. He wanted to see how things stood. She understood reading between the precise lines of her brother's compressed expression, to see her. She wrote back that afternoon. She wrote it in the clear, direct way she'd been writing everything lately, not performing warmth she didn't feel, but not withholding the warmth she did. She told him the rosebush made her glad. She told him to come for the provision delivery. She told him what he'd written had been the right thing to write, and that she'd known it for months, and that saying it plainly had been worth doing regardless. She told him, "You're not a bad man, Cal. You are a man who learned to survive at the expense of asking for help. And you applied that habit to me because you didn't know another way. I'm not saying this to excuse it. I'm saying it because I think you need to understand the difference between what you did and who you are. They are not the same thing." She sealed the letter and gave it to Pete Halloran on his Friday run, and she did not feel, when it left her hand, the residue of old grievance she'd expected. She felt something cleaner, something that might have been, in a modest way, resolution. The first hard frost came that night. She woke at 3 in the morning to the sound of the temperature change, the settling of the house timbers, a particular silence that meant the air had gone sharp. She got up and looked out the east window, and the grass was silver white in the moonlight, frozen stiff, the fence post standing out black against it. She stood there for several minutes. She was not cold. She'd become, over the months, more acclimatized to the ranch's thermal logic, wearing more layers earlier, knowing which drafts to stop and which to accept. She stood and looked at the frozen moonlit flats, and she thought about the fact that this was the same sky that was over Ash Hollow right now, the same moon, the same cold coming down from the same north. She thought about what it meant that the same world could feel so different depending on where you were standing in it. She went back to bed. She slept. The morning was extraordinary, the frost catching the dawn light in a way that made the entire ranch look like it had been edged in something precious. Every blade of grass, every fence wire, the roof of the barn, all of it rimmed in silver. She stood in the cookhouse doorway as she always did, and the beauty of it was the kind that hits you in the chest before your mind catches up, the kind you don't quite have language for. She heard Mercer's step on the porch. He came to stand beside her. Not close, but close enough that she was aware of his warmth in the cold air. And he looked at the frost on the ranch with the same contained but genuine quality he brought to everything. "First hard one," he said. "Yes." "It'll be like this through March," he said. Not as a warning, just as a fact about the place he was offering her. "I know," she said. "I've been reading ahead in the winter provision accounts." I was quiet for a moment. Then, "You're not worried about it?" "The cold?" She considered. "No, I don't think so." "Good." He looked at the frost a moment longer. Then he turned and went to the barn, and she turned and went to the stove, and the morning began its work. It was in that third week of October that she finally understood what she was building. Not as an idea, she'd had the idea for some time, in the vague way you have ideas before they solidify, but as a concrete, specific thing she could look at and describe. She was in the provision cellar doing the autumn inventory when it came to her, which was appropriate in a way she would have appreciated if she'd been less absorbed in the moment. She was counting sacks of dried corn and making notes in the ledger, and she stopped, pencil in hand, and sat back on her heels in the dim, cool space, and she thought, "This is mine." Not in the legal sense. Not in any sense she could have defended to anyone who asked, but in the sense that matters more, the sense of genuine investment, genuine care, genuine knowledge. She knew this cellar the way you know something you've worked with and for. She knew where the damp came in and where it didn't. She knew the optimal rotation of the stores and the order in which things should be used and the precise point at which a supply of anything became critically low. She knew it the way she knew the cookhouse and the ledger and the east fence line and the 12 miles to the creek crossing. She had been thinking of herself all this time as a person who had come here to survive, to find somewhere she could be without the weight of Ash Hollow's judgment, to do useful work and earn something and not be laughed at in the market square. Those had been the goals she'd started with, and they had been achieved, quickly and more thoroughly than she'd dared expect. But sitting in the cellar with a ledger and the smell of dried corn and the faint sound of the ranch above her, she understood that somewhere in the 4 months of daily work and daily choice, she had stopped surviving and started building. The distinction mattered. Surviving was reactive, responding to what threatened, managing what came. Building was something else. It was choosing to put your effort into something because you had decided it was worth your effort, because you could see what it might become, and you wanted to be part of making it that. She wanted Iron Ridge to be better for her having been here. She wanted the ledger she'd redesigned, and the cellar she'd organized and the supply system she'd established to matter 10 years from now, to be the foundation that some future version of this operation stood on. She wanted that with the specific wanting of a person who has finally found something they care about enough to want it outlast them. She finished the inventory. She climbed out of the cellar into the afternoon light and brushed the dust from her skirt and stood in the yard for a moment, blinking. Mercer was coming across from the barn. He saw her and changed direction slightly, the small adjustment of a man who has started noticing where another person is and moving accordingly without making it conspicuous. "Cellar done?" he said. "Done." She handed him the ledger page. "We're short on the dried beans. We'll need to reorder before the deep cold sets in, or the road won't be passable for the delivery wagon." He looked at the numbers. "I'll send word with Pete on Friday." "Also the lamp oil," she said. "We're lower than we should be for winter." He made a note in his own tally book. She watched him write, his handwriting the compressed practical script of a man who had learned to write for records rather than for pleasure. And she thought about the first night she'd arrived and he'd shown her through the house in his restrained way. The one who'd said, "I don't require fuss," and meant it completely. And she thought about how different the silence between them was now. It had the same quietness, but the quality of it had changed, the way silence changes when it goes from being the absence of something to being the presence of understanding. "Mercer," she said. He looked up. She was not by nature a woman who said difficult things first. She had spent years not saying difficult things, not because she was afraid of them, but because she had learned that other people were generally not ready to receive them, and that receiving an honest thing before you're ready for it makes you flinch and pull back. And she had seen too many true things land badly to be careless about the delivery. But she had been thinking, since the cellar, about what she'd realized. And she had been thinking about what he'd said in the front room that afternoon. "I was not prepared for you, and looking forward to supper, and it's not offered lightly." And she had been thinking about the way he handed her coffee in the morning now, without comment, as though it had always been the custom, as though the custom intended to continue. "I want to stay," she said. "Not as the housekeeper." She held his gaze. "I want to be here, all the way here. If that's something that makes sense to you." He looked at her. He was quiet for what was probably 8 or 10 seconds, which on Rowan Mercer was not hesitation but thought. The specific quality of thought he gave to things that mattered, that she had learned not to mistake for uncertainty. "It makes sense to me," he said. His voice was level and certain, and it did not perform anything. It was just true. "All right," she said. "All right," he said. She went back to the cookhouse. He went back to the barn. The afternoon continued in its ordinary way, the light moving across the frozen grass, the horses making their sounds, the distant work of the ranch producing its background of small, purposeful noises. She started supper. Her hands were steady. She was not trembling. She was not overwhelmed. She felt instead a kind of bedrock calm, the calm of someone who has said a true thing and had it received truthfully, with nothing performed on either side, and who has therefore arrived at a solid place. She thought, this is what it feels like when two people are honest with each other from the beginning. Not the dizzying uncertainty of a thing built on impression and performance. Just this. Solid, real, requiring daily work to maintain, like everything worth having. Cal arrived in mid-November on Pete Halloran's wagon with the winter provision delivery. 3 other men besides Pete, the wagon loaded heavy with goods that would carry Iron Ridge through the deep, cold months. It was the first real logistical challenge of the season, and Lenora had spent 2 days preparing for it. The cellar reorganized to accept the incoming stores, the inventory updated to account for the integration, a clear plan for the sequence of unloading that would minimize the time the goods were in the cold. When the wagon came through the gate, she was in the yard. Cal climbed down, and they looked at each other, and then she walked to him, and he put his arms around her, and this time neither of them made it quick. "You look different," he said when he stepped back. "You said that last time," she said. "I mean it more this time." He looked at her carefully. "You look Solid. Like you've landed somewhere. I have, she said. He nodded slowly. He looked at the ranch around him, the organized yard, the barn with its winter preparations visible in the stacked hay and the tended fence line, the house with its new shingles and its repaired east eave. He looked at it all with the eye of a man who has seen something he had a small and imperfect part in creating and is trying to work out what he owes it. Mercer came down from the porch and extended his hand, and Cal shook it, and the two men looked at each other with the specific measuring quality of men who have been on the periphery of the same story and are meeting its center for the first time. She watched it happen and did not intervene. Your sister has been essential to this operation, Mercer said. He said it the way he said true things, without decoration. Cal looked at Lenora. I know, he said. She's been essential her whole life. We just didn't always... He stopped. We didn't always show it. Mercer nodded once, briefly, the way he acknowledged things that were being said right. They unloaded the wagon over the course of the afternoon, all hands working, and Lenora directed the operation with the confidence of someone who had planned it and knew exactly where every item was going. She told Dex where to stack the hay bales. She showed Jesse the new section of the cellar she'd designated for the bulk dry goods. She kept the inventory in her head and on paper simultaneously, checking each delivery against the order, noting 2 short items and 1 substitution that would need adjusting. Cal watched her work. She was aware of him watching, aware in the way you're always aware of a sibling, a kind of peripheral knowing that doesn't require looking. She didn't perform for his observation. She just worked, and she let the work be what it was. At one point, she was directing Colt with a heavy sack when Colt stumbled on the cellar steps and went sideways, and she caught the other end of the sack before it pulled him down, taking the weight without thinking, and they righted it together and got it onto the shelf. And when she looked up, Cal was standing in the cellar doorway, looking at her with an expression she had no word for, something between recognition and grief, and something that might have been, if Cal were capable of the word, reverence. She looked back at him. You could have just let it go, he said. It was $2 of dried corn, she said. I wasn't going to let it go. He laughed. An actual laugh, short and genuine. She hadn't heard him laugh like that in years. The specific laugh that belonged to before, to when they were children in a house that still had both parents in it. No, he said. I don't suppose you were. They ate supper together that night. All of them. Pete and the delivery men, and Cal, and the hands. The table full in a way it was rarely full. The cookhouse warm against the November outside. The conversation louder and less contained than usual. She had made extra, and it was enough, which was satisfying in the specific way of having planned correctly and seen the plan hold. Cal sat next to Dex, and they talked. She caught fragments of it across the table, something about the road conditions, and something about cattle prices. And she watched her brother in this place, in her place, and she thought about what it meant that she could now think of it as hers without qualification. After the meal, when the delivery men had gone to the bunkhouse, Pete kept in the barn for the overnight stops, and the hands had dispersed, and it was just the 3 of them, her and Cal and Mercer. At the cleared table with the lamp burning low, Mercer excused himself to do the evening round of the stock, as he always did, giving them the space she'd told him with her eyes that she would need. She and Cal sat with their coffee. The ranch was quiet. I owe you more than a letter, Cal said. The letter was enough, she said. But yes, you do. He turned his cup in his hands, the old habit, the worn gesture. I've been thinking about what I traded, he said. When I made the arrangement, I told myself I was finding you a future. But what I was actually doing was taking your present, your right to decide what your future was going to be. He paused. I can justify it 6 ways if I try. I won't. She looked at her brother, at the honest difficulty in his face, at the effort it took him to stay in this without retreating into the justifications she could see him deliberately not reaching for. Do you know what I've learned here? She said. He shook his head. That the hardest thing isn't the work, she said. The work is just work. The hardest thing is believing that your judgment about your own life is worth trusting. She paused. I didn't believe that when I left Ash Hollow. I'd been told, in every way people tell you things without saying them directly, that my judgment about myself was faulty. That the way the town saw me was more accurate than the way I saw myself. She looked at him steadily. You didn't cause that, but you didn't help. And the arrangement didn't help either, because even if it came good, even if this turned out to be right, arriving somewhere as a solution to someone else's problem is not the same as choosing it yourself. Cal was quiet for a long moment. No, he said, it isn't. But I did choose it, she said. Maybe not at the beginning, but now. Everything I am here, everything I've built here, I've chosen every day, and that changes it. That makes it mine. She paused. I want you to understand that. Not so you feel less guilty, because it's true and it's important. He looked at her. His eyes were bright in a way he would have been mortified to acknowledge, so she didn't acknowledge it. She would have loved this, he said. Their mother. He didn't say the name. He didn't need to. I know, she said softly. They sat for a while in the quiet of that. Outside, the wind was moving across the flats, the low winter wind that came in long, slow pulls and made the house timbers settle. The lamp flame dipped and steadied. Mercer's a good man, Cal said finally. He is. He looks at you like... He stopped, started again. Like you're the most solid thing on the property. She was quiet for a moment. Yes, she said. I think that might be right. Cal nodded. He finished his coffee. He was staying the night. Pete's run went back south in the morning, and she'd made up the spare room on the ground floor, the one nobody used, with clean linens and a good blanket against the cold. She showed him to it and said good night, and he held her once more briefly at the door. Write more, she said. I will, he said, and this time she believed him. She went upstairs. She stood at the east window in the cold of the November night, and the flats were white with moonlight on frost again, and the stars were out in their winter configuration, brighter and more numerous than they were in summer, the cold making everything in the sky more precise. She thought about what she'd said to Cal about choosing, about how arriving somewhere is different from staying, and staying is different from building, and building is different from belonging. She had moved through all of those stages in 4 months, and she did not think that was fast. She thought it was exactly the pace of something real. She thought about Ash Hollow. She did not think about it with pain, which was itself a thing worth noting. The pain had not disappeared, but it had changed form. It had become part of the record rather than part of the present. Morton Dale's grunt and Vera Calhoun's deliberate pauses and the church steps conversations she'd never been invited into, those things had happened. They had shaped her in ways she was still discovering, but they were not the largest thing in her story anymore. She was the largest thing in her story. That had not always been true. She heard Mercer come in, the front door, the familiar step in the hall below, the sounds of a man at the end of his day. She heard him stop at the foot of the stairs in the particular way he sometimes did, a brief stillness she'd come to recognize as him simply being present in the house, in a way he hadn't been before she was in it. Then she heard him go to his room, and the house settled, and everything was quiet. She was still at the window. The frost on the flats caught the moonlight and held it, the whole landscape a study in stillness and cold, and the particular beauty of a world that does not arrange itself for your appreciation and is therefore genuinely beautiful. She had not been rescued. That was the thing she wanted to hold clearly, because it was the thing that mattered most in the long accounting of what this was. Rowan Mercer had not saved her. He had offered her work, real work, hard work, work that required everything she had. And she had done it, and in the doing of it, she had saved herself. The confidence she felt standing in this room, in this ranch, in this life she had built daily, with her own hands and mind, and stubborn refusal to be less than she was, that was hers. It had not been given to her. It had been earned in root cellars, and on rooftops, and in the saddle, at 5 a.m, and at the table, with a ledger at midnight. Love had grown. She would not call it anything else because it was what it was, but it had grown the way things grow in real soil, slowly, and with roots that went deep because they had to, because the surface was hard, and the weather was not always kind, and only the things with real roots survived the winters. She was 23 years old, and she knew, with the certainty of someone who has tested a thing thoroughly rather than assumed it, that she was worth exactly as much as she had always been worth. Not more because of what she'd built here, not less because of what Ash Hollow had said about her for years. Exactly what she had always been, which was more than enough. The months that followed were not uncomplicated. Life at Iron Ridge in deep winter was its own education. Pipes that froze before dawn. Cattle that needed attention in temperatures that made every task twice as hard. Provisions that had to be managed with precision because the next supply run was weeks away, and miscalculation meant genuine shortage. She learned it all. She made mistakes, ordered short on the salt, and had to stretch the preserved goods with less seasoning for 2 weeks. Misjudged the capacity of the root cellar under freeze conditions, and lost a portion of the stored turnips to cold damage she hadn't anticipated. She noted these mistakes in the ledger, because a mistake you don't record is a mistake you're likely to repeat, and she did not intend to repeat them. Mercer did not make her feel bad about the mistakes. He also did not pretend they hadn't happened, because he was not that kind of man. He simply incorporated them into the operational knowledge of the ranch, the way all operational knowledge got incorporated, as information, useful for next time. What they built between them in those winter months was not the kind of thing that announces itself. It was the kind built in early mornings when the cold was still dark outside, and the cookhouse was the warmest room in the world, and two people shared coffee in a quiet that had become, over months, one of the most comfortable silences either of them had known. It was built in the evenings over the ledger and the tally books, and the practical conversation of two people running something together. It was built in the small agreements: where to put the lamp, whose turn it was to check the north fence, whether the morning clouds meant snow or just cold, and in the larger ones, about the spring cattle plans and the repair priority list, and what needed to happen to the root cellar wall before another winter came. It was not romantic in the way that word usually gets applied. There was no performance of romance, no grand gestures, no declarations beyond the one they had already made in plain language in the front room with the afternoon light going gold around them. What there was, instead, was the daily choice, the thing she had identified as the true measure of commitment, repeated every morning, steady and without ceremony, in the way that Rowan Mercer did all things that mattered to him. Spring came. The frost retreated. The grass returned from brown to green in the sudden, almost violent way of spring in open country. Not gradually, but in a rush, as though the land had been holding its breath and finally let go. The rose bush she had planted against the south wall of the house, a cutting from the one she'd left in Ash Hollow, brought out in the autumn by Cal, who had thought to bring it without being asked, which was the most considerate thing her brother had done in years. The rose bush put out its first small leaves in April. She watched it every morning with the particular attention she'd always given that plant, the inheritance of her mother's patient tending. Dex noted the bush one morning, looking at it with the serious expression he brought to most things. "Roses," he said. "Yes," she said, "don't usually grow out here." "This one will," she said. He looked at her. Then he looked at the bush. Then he nodded, once, with the finality of a man settling a matter, and went about his day. She stood in the yard in the April morning with the new grass coming up green through the frost-brown remnants of last year's growth, and the sky was the particular blue of spring at altitude, almost painfully clear, and the ranch was alive around her in its ordinary, constant, irreplaceable way. Mercer came out of the barn and crossed the yard and stopped beside her, looking at what she was looking at. The valley, the fence lines, the long grass beginning again, the rose bush against the south wall with its early leaves. "You planted it in the fall," he said. "I wanted to see if it would make it," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "And?" She looked at the small green leaves, determined and particular in the morning light. "It made it," she said. He stood beside her in the spring morning, and neither of them said anything else, because there was nothing else that needed saying. The valley stretched away below them in every direction, and the sky went on above it without limit, and the work of the day was waiting, as it always was, as it would always be, with its steady, honest demands. She was not the woman who had stood in the Ash Hollow Market Square with laughter coming at her from every side. She was not the woman who had climbed onto Pete Halloran's wagon with one bag and a piece of paper with 2 columns on it and no certainty about anything. She was not the woman Silas Crow had seen and calculated and offered to improve. She was the woman who had chosen, every single day, to be exactly what she was, who had taken hard work over easy approval, who had learned to ride and fix roofs and read the sky and keep accounts that actually worked, who had told the truth in plain language and waited for it to be received, and who had found, in this place, in this life, in the specific, imperfect, daily reality of Iron Ridge Ranch, that being exactly what she was had been more than enough. It had in fact been everything. The rosebush had 3 blooms by the end of May. Small, deeply red, nothing elaborate. She cut one and put it in a glass on the cookhouse table. Nobody commented on it. Nobody needed to. It was just there, the way she was just there. Chosen, rooted, belonging to the place that had let her grow.